Baptism was a race against death. Imagine a world where a baby's first breath began a desperate countdown. In medieval Europe, baptism was not a gentle celebration, it was a race against death. The moment an infant emerged into the light, families faced the dreadful reality that the child might not survive even a single day. In some regions, as many as 1 in 4 newborns died within a week. No one understood bacteria or infections. Mothers and midwives could do nothing to halt fevers that came without warning. So the Church offered the only defense they believed mattered: baptism. For centuries, Christians believed that every soul carried the stain of original sin. Only baptism could cleanse it and secure a place in heaven. If a child died unbaptized, they risked eternal limbo. So baptism became urgent a sacrament of survival. Midwives kept holy water close at hand. Fathers were trained to perform emergency baptisms themselves if no priest could arrive in time. The ritual had to be spoken precisely, with water poured over the head, while saying, "I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." If the words were wrong or unclear, families lived in fear that the soul remained unprotected. Records from the 15th century are filled with entries like "baptized immediately" or "baptized in danger of death." Sometimes, the baby never left the bedside. In Florence, specialized midwives called levatrici carried vials of water to baptize infants in their first hour of life. Even in wealthy homes, parents prepared for loss. A noble child's legitimacy depended on the Church's recognition, which began the instant baptismal water touched the forehead. Picture the scene: a mother, exhausted and bleeding, watching a midwife whisper Latin prayers over her baby. A father standing nearby, clutching the child's tiny hand, knowing these moments would decide not just life and death, but salvation and damnation. If the baby died without baptism, burial in consecrated ground could be denied. In some regions, unbaptized infants were laid to rest on the threshold of the church, or in unmarked graves along the cemetery wall. The sorrow of losing a child was magnified by fear that their soul remained in limbo. Communities developed customs to meet this grim reality. In Ireland and Scotland, wooden bowls of water sat ready at every birth. In remote villages, melted snow or rainwater became the only hope. Stories spread that a child who died unbaptized would return as a restless spirit, crying in the night. This fear was not superstition alone, it was a way to make sense of an unpredictable world. Even as medical knowledge improved, the urgency of baptism did not fade quickly. In the 1700s and 1800s, parish records still show rushed baptisms within hours of birth. For generations, the ritual remained a shield against forces no one could control. When you see an old baptismal font in a church, imagine the countless parents who stood before it, trembling. For them, baptism was not symbolic, it was an act of defiance against the darkness waiting at the cradle. It declared that every child, no matter how brief their life, was worthy of a name and a place in the community of the living and the dead. In those moments, faith became their only defense, and baptism the final barrier between a fragile newborn and oblivion. Cradle death was so common, it wasn't investigated in the quiet hours before dawn. When the world still clung to darkness, there were moments in medieval households when a silence more profound than any night would settle over a family. Silence, not born of sleep, but of sudden absence. A cradle that only yesterday had been alive with the tiny rustlings of a newborn would, without warning, become still. And in those centuries past, this moment was not rare. It was so common that entire communities learned to absorb it without protest. The death of an infant in its cradle was an event that did not spark an investigation, nor a formal inquiry, nor even a whisper of suspicion in most households. It was treated as an ordinary calamity, as though the life of the smallest among them had never been wholly theirs to keep. To modern eyes, this seems almost inconceivably. Loss so profound met with resignation instead of alarm. But in pre-modern Europe, infant mortality was an ever-present shadow that loomed over childbirth itself. Records suggest that in some regions, as many as 1 in 3 children died before their first birthday. midwives, mothers, and priests all understood that the line between life and death for an infant was astonishingly thin, easily crossed by infections, malnutrition, or simply unknown causes that no one possessed the knowledge to decipher. This is why, when a baby died in its cradle, many assumed it was the fulfillment of God's will or the settling of some unseen cosmic balance. Yet, not all explanations were so pious. In villages from England to the German principalities, there were old beliefs about dark forces slipping into the home at night. Some thought that demons would visit, suffocating the child as a form of punishment or even envy. Others suspected the fairy stove's mischievous spirits, who were believed to steal human babies and replace them with changelings that looked the same but lacked a living soul. When a child appeared lifeless come morning, some parents felt this was proof that a changeling had never truly survived outside the cradle, unable to sustain the spark of genuine human vitality. These supernatural interpretations were not fringe theories, they were woven into the fabric of everyday life. Mothers pinned iron shears or knives near the cradle to ward off evil spirits, believing cold iron repelled the otherworldly. Others placed sprigs of protective herbs or whispered charms in the baby's ear before sleep. And when even these precautions failed, families turned to the clergy to baptize the infant posthumously or to perform rites that would ensure the child's soul did not linger to haunt the living. Despite the presence of such rituals, there was rarely any structured attempt to identify the cause of death. The idea that an infant could be murdered or neglected was simply too explosive to be entertained openly in most communities. Moreover, the scarcity of medical knowledge made it nearly impossible to distinguish between accidental suffocation, sudden illness, and what we now understand as sudden infant death syndrome. In those centuries, there were no forensic tools, no pathology labs, no scientific framework that could shed light on a tiny body that had ceased to breathe in the night. Even coroners, when they did exist, tended to record such deaths in formulaic language: died in sleep, taken by God, death without violence. There was no impetus for deeper examination, because any further inquiry risked implicating the mother who, in nearly every case, was already exhausted, bereft, and terrified of further judgment. To question how an infant died was to cast a shadow of suspicion over the entire family, especially the woman who had been closest to the child. In patriarchal societies, where a woman's virtue was constantly scrutinized, this was often seen as unthinkable cruelty. Some regions did develop limited customs for verifying a death was natural. In a few English parishes, a jury of matrons might be assembled to view the body and confirm that there were no marks of violence. But even this was done more to protect the family from rumors than to seek justice. Most communities clung to the explanation that death had simply arrived, inscrutable and inevitable. In the cradle, it was easier to believe that fate or the supernatural had intervened than to imagine a world so indifferent to infant life that it might extinguish it without cause. The consequences of this acceptance were profound. For one, it meant that true instances of neglect or infanticide could be hidden under the cloak of normalcy. If a child had been smothered by accident, whether through unsafe bedding or sheer fatigue, few dared to admit it openly. And if a desperate mother had ended her child's life, whether from poverty, shame, or madness, there was almost no chance the truth would emerge. Silence protected the grieving, but it also perpetuated a dangerous ignorance that cost countless lives. Meanwhile, religious interpretations often reinforced the passivity with which cradle deaths were met. Some theologians taught that such deaths were divine judgments for the sins of the parents or the community as a whole. Others insisted the child had been called to heaven before it could be corrupted by earthly existence, a belief that brought comfort to some and guilt to others. In this way, the theology itself became another barrier to critical inquiry. Even so, you can sense the desperate love families still had for their children. They buried them with care, marked their tiny graves with tokens, and spoke their names. In hushed tones, they believed, as best they could, that they were powerless to prevent these tragedies. And in a time when nearly everything about infancy was uncertain, they were not entirely wrong. No mother or father knew when death might visit. No physician knew how to prevent it. No priest knew why some survived and others did not. It would not be until the Enlightenment and the early scientific revolutions of the 17th and 18th centuries that the first medical treatises began to explore childhood disease and mortality in earnest. Even then, it took generations before doctors recognized that sudden infant death was neither proof of witchcraft nor a moral failing. It was a physiological event, sometimes preventable, sometimes not. What feels most haunting about this history is how ordinary cradle death once was. Imagine the psychological toll of living in a society where every cradle was a site of both hope and looming dread, where the first months of a baby's life were a prolonged vigil, and every dawn brought the possibility of unspeakable loss. To modern sensibilities, it sounds like a culture steeped in fatalism. And in many ways, it was. But that fatalism was born of centuries of helplessness in the face of forceless disease, poverty, superstition that no one yet understood how to master. Perhaps this is why the old stories of demons and fairies persisted for so long. They gave shape to something formless, made the randomness of death feel like a narrative instead of an accident. They allowed families to grieve without turning that grief against each other. In this way, the legends served an essential psychological purpose. They helped people endure the unbearable. Yet, when we look back, we can also see how this web of resignation and myth robbed generations of children of the protection they deserved. It kept questions from being asked, kept evidence from being gathered, and made it all too easy to accept the deaths of the most vulnerable as inevitable. And perhaps that is the most sobering lesson of all. That in any society, what becomes common can also become invisible. When something happens often enough, it slips beneath the surface of curiosity and accountability. It becomes something people no longer think to question. But the frequency of a tragedy does not lessen its weight. Each small life lost in those cradles was a universe of possibility, extinguished hand, though their families may have believed the cause was fate. Time has shown us that the truth was always more complex, more human, and more heartbreaking than they could bear to see. Mothers were told not to get too attached. Imagine bringing a new life into a world already shaped by the expectation of death. In medieval Europe, this was not simply a possibility, was a grim certainty many families carried in their hearts. From the moment a child took its first breath, parents were cautioned, almost with a cold detachment, that love itself was a dangerous indulgence. Clergy, scholars, and midwives alike repeated the same refrain. Do not allow yourself to love your child too deeply. For if you did, you were tempting both earthly sorrow and spiritual retribution. This was an age when infant mortality hovered at staggering levels. Some estimates suggest that as many as 1 in 3 infants would not live to see their first year. Diseases we now consider preventable, like dysentery or pneumonia, swept through households without discrimination. And so, in sermons and confessional whispers, priests warned that a mother's affection could become a form of idolatry. They spoke of divine punishment not merely as a theological abstraction, but as a real, imminent threat. If a mother grieved too hard when her baby died, it was seen as proof that she loved the child more than God's will itself. The Church, which held sway over almost every dimension of existence, promoted this ideology as a form of spiritual discipline. Priests often cited the Book of Job to remind congregants that every joy was lent, not owned. Some preachers argued that mothers were merely stewards of God's souls, caretakers of a fragile body that might never be meant to last. In their view, every birth was a transaction with heaven, and every death a repayment of debt. But beneath these doctrines lay a darker reality. This emotional austerity was not only about faith, it was also about survival. To the clergy, excessive attachment to a baby was a dangerous distraction from one's duties to the broader family, to the parish, and to God. In communities ravaged by plague or famine, despair could be as infectious as disease itself. A mother, crushed by grief, might be unable to care for her surviving children. So religious authorities developed a theology that framed detachment as virtue and mourning as a kind of hidden sin. It's almost unbearable to imagine what that did to the bond between parent and child. Picture a woman who has carried an infant through a winter of hunger, only to be told that any joy she feels must be carefully contained. If the baby stirred in the night, she might rock it gently, but never let her heart cross the invisible line between care and adoration. For many mothers, this meant rehearsing grief before it arrived. Some historians believe that certain communities even practiced what you might call preemptive mourning rituals, small acts that prepared the mind for the child's likely death. In some regions, parents were discouraged from naming a child for several weeks or even months, as though withholding identity might protect them from the agony of loss. These customs weren't uniform across all of Europe. In some places, older folk beliefs competed with Christian doctrine. For instance, in parts of Scandinavia, families believed that fairies or spirits might steal a baby who was too openly cherished. A mother who sang to many lullabies or bragged about her infant's beauty was thought to attract envious supernatural forces. Even this superstition, however, shared the same core idea: if you love too much, you will suffer more. The clergy also preached that the death of a child was a test of faith. If a mother's grief was too visible, it became evidence of spiritual weakness. Priests would warn that excessive sorrow could offend God, who had only retrieved what was always his. In some sermons, the language was almost cruel in its calmness. The baby was merely a visitor, and you should not mistake its presence for a promise of permanence. Consider the psychological cost of this doctrine. The emotional calculus parents were asked to perform was nearly impossible. They had to provide warmth and sustenance, but never too much hope. They had to watch for fevers and infections, yet accept that these tiny bodies were likely to fail. Even more devastating, they were told that if their child died, their own love might be partly to blame, an affront to the divine order. And so mothers learned to swallow their longing. They learned to keep their voices steady when they prayed over tiny shrouds and closed tiny eyelids. They learned to reassemble their faith each time they buried another newborn. But not every parent could manage this spiritual balancing act. Diaries and letters from the period reveal raw, uncontainable grief, sometimes expressed only in the margins of a ledger or in a private prayer scribbled under the cover of darkness. One mother, in England, whose child died before its baptism, confessed to her confessor that she had felt more love than she had ever dared to show. She feared that her secret joy had condemned her baby to the grave. This guilt, compounded by religious instruction, could haunt families for generations. Even fathers were not immune. Though less directly accused of idolatry, men were also warned to keep their paternal affection measured and dignified. A father who mourned too openly might be seen as unmanly, as if sorrow itself were a spiritual flaw. It is tempting to judge these attitudes as mere superstition, a relic of a time when life was shorter and harder. But it is also important to understand that these beliefs were shaped by real desperation. When death was so frequent, the only defense left was to ration out love as though it were another scarce resource. To love freely was to invite devastation over and over again. So the clergy's warnings functioned almost like a psychological vaccine. Inoculate yourself against loss by denying the full measure of your affection. Some families resisted this counsel in quiet ways. They gave their babies secret pet names, whispered in the privacy of the hearth. They made small tokens, a scrap of cloth, a carved wooden toy that held meaning only within the family. These hidden acts of tenderness were a kind of rebellion, a way to affirm that even in a world dominated by fear and death, love still mattered. Over time, as medical knowledge advanced and infant mortality began to decline, this harsh theology lost some of its grip. By the Enlightenment, new philosophies of childhood emerged that celebrated the innocence and worth of every child's life, but the centuries of spiritual austerity left their mark. Generations grew up believing that their parents' restraint was not neglect but necessity, and in a way, this legacy persisted long after the doctrine faded. Even today, traces Of this thinking can be found in the notion that too much attachment, too much feeling, makes us vulnerable to ruin. The medieval church may have given these ideas religious justification, but the underlying fear is as old as humanity itself. The fear that if you love something too deeply, you give the world a weapon to destroy you. So when you hear that mothers were told not to get too attached to their babies, remember that this was not simply a superstition. It was a strategy for emotional survival in an age when death visited every household sooner or later. It was an attempt to impose order on the chaos of mortality. It was a reflection of a culture that measured piety not only by devotion to God, but by the ability to restrain the most human instinct of all, the need to love. And in that struggle, you can hear the echo of every parent who has ever tried, and failed, to protect their heart from the inevitable loss that comes with caring. Swaddling was a prison sentence. Imagine being born into a world where your first experience of life was not the warmth of a mother's arms, but the suffocating embrace of linen strips wound around your tiny body. For countless infants across Europe, from the Middle Ages through the Enlightenment, swaddling was not a gentle wrapping, it was a sentence of near-complete immobility that could last not days or weeks, but the better part of a year. To modern minds, the practice is almost impossible to comprehend. Why would any society bind its newborns so tightly that their arms and legs were forced into rigid alignment, their chests compressed, their breathing shallow? The answer is a mixture of fear, belief, and the stubborn conviction that nature, left unrestrained, would inevitably warp a child's body and soul. Swaddling was practiced in diverse cultures, but in Europe it became systematized into something almost ritualistic. Immediately after birth, a midwife would wash and oil the baby's skin, then begin the elaborate wrapping. Long bands of cloths, sometimes as long as 10 feet, were wound over the infant's body in precise layers. The arms were pinned stiffly to the sides, the legs straightened and pressed together, the torso pulled tight until the child could not move. Swaddling bands were often so tight that if you lifted the baby upright, the little body remained in the same inflexible pose as if encased in plaster, and that was precisely the point. Medieval and early modern thinkers believed the human body was born misshapen, soft, and dangerously fluid. If a baby were allowed to wriggle freely, its limbs would supposedly grow crooked, the spine would twist, and the head might flatten into grotesque deformity. Parents were taught that only strict discipline applied immediately could ensure a child grew straight and strong. The earliest known medical texts prescribing swaddling appear in the 1st century CE. Cyrannus of Ephesus, an influential Roman pediatrician, described the wrapping in detail, claiming it promoted uniform growth and kept the baby warm. But by the late Middle Ages, this thinking hardened into doctrine. Manuals and household guides spread the notion that swaddling was an obligation, not a choice. In England, the practice was so entrenched that one 16th century midwife proudly claimed she could swaddle an infant so precisely it would not stir for hours. The baby's comfort mattered little compared to the conviction that discipline began from the first breath. Some parents left their infants bound for months without ever unwrapping the arms. Diaries and letters reveal that children were often unwrapped only once a day, sometimes lest you change the linens soiled with urine or feces. Physicians of the period noted that prolonged swaddling sometimes led to suffocation. A baby with a fever or a respiratory infection might be unable to expand its chest against the tight bands. But these warnings rarely shifted tradition. The alternative, loose limbs, a soft skull, the terrifying specter of deformity, was deemed a far worse fate. And so, generations of children were confined in this silent prison. Consider what daily life meant to them. Every attempt to stretch or flex was met with resistance. They could not bring their hands to their mouths, could not touch their faces, could not kick or crawl. The sensation of being encased became their entire reality. Some researchers believe that this prolonged immobilization delayed muscle development, contributed to hip dysplasia, and hindered normal neurological growth. But in the minds of medieval caregivers, a motionless baby was an obedient baby, and obedience was virtue. Historical records suggest that in some cultures, infants were left bound to cradles or boards for hours without supervision. In France, cradles were sometimes suspended from the ceiling so the baby could be rocked without being unwrapped. In England and Germany, swaddled infants were often hung near the hearth for warmth. If the bindings were loosened, a mother or nurse was expected to tighten them again. Even among the wealthy, where embroidered swaddling bands were status symbols, the essential purpose was the same: containment. The bindings announced to the world that here was a child under control, one whose limbs would grow straight, whose will would be tamed, whose body would not betray the family with shameful deformity. But occasionally, voices of doubt rose. In 1536, Erasmus of Rotterdam wrote scornfully that children were wrapped so cruelly that they are more like mummies than living creatures. Other physicians quietly noted that mortality rates were higher among babies who remained bound through illness. Yet such critiques were overshadowed by centuries of conviction that nature itself must be corrected. Even when Enlightenment thinkers began to challenge old customs in the 18th century, swaddling remained common. Some reformers argued that babies should be allowed to move freely, to explore and develop their muscles without constraint. But tradition dies slowly. In rural Europe, swaddling persisted well into the 19th century. Imagine the psychological imprint this left an infant's earliest sensations. The first lessons about the world were lessons of restriction. To be alive was to be confined. To breathe was to strain against cloth. To exist was to be shaped by hands that believed tightness was salvation. Historians today debate whether parents believed they were acting out of love or duty. Probably, it was both. They loved their children fiercely. They feared for their health, their reputation, their prospects, and so they submitted to the same old instructions: bind the child, bind the child, bind the child. Yet, hidden in these instructions was a chilling paradox. The act of binding a baby's limbs intended to preserve life and health sometimes threatened both. While the mother imagined she was protecting her infant from deformity, she might have been starving her of air. While she reassured herself that stillness meant safety, it also meant weakness and vulnerability. In this way, swaddling embodied the most haunting contradiction of pre-modern child-rearing. The fear of imperfection was so powerful that it became a prison. Today, some cultures still practice forms of swaddling, though modern versions are generally looser and designed for short-term comfort rather than total immobilization. Pediatricians caution against overly tight wrapping, especially around the chest, because it can interfere with breathing and hip development. Yet the memory of those centuries when babies were all but mummified lingers as a reminder of how easily love can be entangled with fear, and how fear, when dignified as tradition, can harden into cruelty. If you close your eyes for a moment, you might imagine that ancient nursery. The fire glows low. A mother smooths the last fold of linen across a child's face. The baby's eyes flicker, the lips quiver, but the limbs remain pinned and helpless. This was not an isolated practice. This was normal, expected, lauded as progress. And for the smallest among us, it was a sentence quiet and unseen that shaped the first months of life with silence and restraint. A sentence from which no infant could escape, save in dreams or in death. Wet nurses were more trusted than mothers in medieval and early modern Europe. The moment a child was born into nobility, the mother was often relieved of what we today would consider the most fundamental duty of parenthood: feeding, comforting, and simply being present with her baby. The aristocratic belief was that a noblewoman's body and time were too valuable to be squandered in the tasks of nursing. Instead, that role fell to another woman, entirely the wet nurse. These wet nurses were not merely assistants, they became the surrogate mothers in every meaningful sense, a reality that shaped the earliest bonds of countless generations. In many noble households, the child was removed from the mother's chamber within days or even hours of birth. The baby was transported sometimes across miles of rough countryside to the home of the wet nurse. There, in an entirely different environment, the child would spend the first years of life, not days, not weeks, but sometimes 3 or 4. Years passed before the biological mother laid eyes again on her son or daughter. This was not an isolated practice. In France, records from the 16th century show that in Paris alone, thousands of infants were boarded out each year. In some districts, over 90% of babies born to noble or affluent families were sent to live with wet nurses. That staggering figure tells you just how deeply institutionalized this arrangement had become. The reasons for this were a mix of ideology, superstition, and convenience. First, there was the pervasive medical belief, promoted by doctors and clergymen alike, that breast milk was not simply nutrition, but a carrier of character. If a noblewoman was considered frail or morally suspect, her milk was thought to transmit weakness or sin. Conversely, if a wet nurse was robust, pious, and from good peasant stock, her milk was believed to instill vigor and virtue. So the very personality of the child, their moral fiber and physical strength, was thought to derive from the milk they drank. For wealthy families obsessed with lineage and reputation, this belief alone was enough to outsource breastfeeding. But the motivations didn't end there. Another factor was the expectation that a noblewoman should quickly return to her social duties, hosting salons, maintaining her appearance, and securing the next pregnancy. Breastfeeding was believed to interfere with fertility, delaying the return of the menstrual cycle, and reducing the chances of conceiving again soon. In an age when the survival of dynasties depended on producing multiple heirs, anything that delayed childbearing was considered irresponsible. So even mothers who might have wished to keep their infants close were pressured by husbands, in-laws, and advisors to hand them over. From a practical perspective, this system also allowed aristocratic households to function smoothly, while the mother rested, recovered, and re-entered public life. The wet nurse managed the endless demands of an infant feeding every few hours, rocking the baby through illness and soothing inconsolable cries. In return, the wet nurse was paid a wage that, for many peasant women, was the single most reliable income available. However, this arrangement was far from benign for either party. Wet nurses often had to leave their own newborns behind, sometimes risking their survival to earn money for the family. Some wet nurses tried to keep both their biological child and the noble infant together, but this was discouraged and sometimes outright banned, because employers feared the noble baby would get inferior attention. In fact, manuals circulated with explicit instructions warning wet nurses not to lavish too much affection on their own offspring, so as not to neglect the employer's child. If that detail doesn't stop you cold, consider this. Some women were compelled to wean their own infants, prematurely, effectively risking their health so they could produce an abundant milk supply for the noble baby. These choices were rarely choices at all. For many wet nurses, it was a stark calculation of hunger versus sorrow. Over time, this system created a bizarre emotional paradox. Noble children often grew up forming their most formative attachments, not to their mothers, but to the wet nurses. The first face they recognized, the first voice they learned to trust, belonged to a woman they would eventually be forced to leave. Once they reached toddlerhood, a courier would arrive, scoop up the child screaming bewildered and deliver them back to the biological family. For the noble parents, this was simply the next step in a predetermined script. Time to have the child educated, socialized, and prepared for the responsibilities of rank. But for the child, it was a profound rupture. Imagine spending the first years of your life cradled in the arms of one woman, only to be torn away and handed to strangers whose claim to you was a mere fact of biology. Historians have suggested that this early separation may have shaped the cold, transactional nature of elite family relationships. Even in private letters, you can read the odd formality between aristocratic parents and children, a tone closer to distant patrons than to flesh and blood. The emotional cost of this system was rarely acknowledged. Wet nurses, too, endured heartbreak. Some were forbidden any future contact with the child they had nurtured as their own. Others were summoned to noble estates to see the child in later years, but only as a servant, not as a mother figure. One can imagine the confusing ache of witnessing the child you loved address someone else as mother. If you search through parish records, you find poignant traces of these arrangements' baptism registers, listing the wet nurse as the sponsor or godparent, almost as if she were the child's true kin. In some rare cases, noble families expressed gratitude with lifelong pensions or dowries, but more often, wet nurses faded back into anonymity as soon as the child was reclaimed. What's perhaps most striking is how enduring and widespread this practice remained, even as moralists occasionally condemned it. Writers and theologians decried the coldness of mothers who preferred their own vanity to the company of their children. Satirists mocked aristocrats who treated motherhood as a passing inconvenience rather than a sacred bond. But the system was too embedded to dismantle overnight. In a world that linked maternal duty to reputation, wealth, and fear of disease, wet nurses became indispensable. By the 18th century, urban centers like Paris, London, and Florence had entire bureaucracies dedicated to regulating wet contracts. Inspectors were dispatched to assess the health and moral character of wet nurses, to weigh the babies they cared for, and to levy fines if conditions were deemed inadequate. What began as a domestic arrangement had evolved into an industry, complete with contracts, penalties, and a chilling efficiency. Some records even note that if an infant died in the care of a wet nurser, sadly frequent outcome due to malnutrition or infection, she could be accused of negligence or witchcraft. The fear of such accusations led many wet nurses to live under constant scrutiny and anxiety. Yet the upper classes largely accepted this system as the natural order. The wet nurse was trusted more than the biological mother because she was seen as a professional, a woman whose body was literally her trade. The mother, in contrast, was too delicate, too distracted, or too important to engage in the primitive work of nourishing a baby. It is a mindset that seems alien to us today, yet in many ways it laid the foundation for modern debates about childcare, maternal absence, and the commodification of care work. When we look back at the centuries when wet nurses were more trusted than mothers, we are forced to ask unsettling questions about love, labor, and status. What does it mean when society decides that a stranger can nurture a child more capably than the person who gave birth to them? What is lost when the first and most intimate connection is outsourced to another woman's arms? The answers are not simple, but they echo across time, reminding us that history is not merely a record of events. It is a mirror reflecting the choices, compromises, and blind spots that define us. Boys were given weapons by age 5. Imagine a boy not yet tall enough to look his father in the eye, barely old enough to recite a prayer without stumbling, but already expected to hold a sword steady in both hands. In medieval Europe, the training of a future knight did not wait for adolescence. It began as early as 5 years old, when boys were pulled from the world of their mothers and thrust into a new existence defined by discipline, violence, and unrelenting expectation. Before they could read a single line of scripture, they were drilled in the art of killing. These boys were often the sons of nobility, born into families whose fortunes depended on land, alliances, and warfare. The title of knight was not simply an honor, it was a profession and a duty. To defend your lord's holdings, to protect the realm, to preserve your bloodline's claim to power, these were obligations every noble family took seriously. So, from their earliest memories, young boys were conditioned to believe that their worth began and ended with their courage and skill in combat. A boy's training started with wooden swords, which were never toys. In many households, these replicas were intentionally heavy, meant to strengthen the arms and teach the proper balance of grip and stance. Under the watchful eye of older squires, or knights, the boys learned how to parry and strike, how to avoid being disarmed, how to fall without breaking an arm. These lessons were never optional. To refuse to pick up the sword was to invite shame, punishment, or both. Accounts from the 13th and 14th centuries describe how squires and pages were subjected to public humiliation if they showed fear. In some training halls, known as the lists, a boy who flinched during practice was beaten with the flat side of a wooden blade. Chroniclers wrote that such beatings were not considered cruelty, they were seen as necessary correction. If a child could not learn to withstand pain or stand his ground in a controlled setting, he would never survive the chaos of battle. The term cowardice was not used lightly. It marked a stain on a family's honor, a failing that could ripple through generations. These training grounds were not hidden away in secluded corners. They often sat near the great hall or within the castle yard, visible to the household and visiting nobles. Every mistake had an audience. For a boy of 5 or 6, this visibility could be terrifying, but, in the logic of the age, that was the point. The sooner a child learned to swallow fear, the more likely he would become a man ready to ride into combat without hesitation. Physical training was only part of the regimen. By the time a boy reached 7, he was expected to serve as a page, attending to the needs of the lord and lady. He carried messages, polished armor, tended to horses, and learned the elaborate rituals of courtly behavior. Even these tasks had a martial purpose: to embed in the child a deep respect for hierarchy and the tools of war. To serve a knight was to witness daily the burden of command and the cost of failure. Boys drilled in mock battles, using wooden shields and blunted lances, often against older boys who did not hold back. These contests were designed to simulate the confusion and danger of real combat. Chroniclers record injuries ranging from broken noses to fractured ribs, and in rare cases, deaths from accidents. Such outcomes were tragic, but accepted as part of a system that valued readiness over safety. To modern eyes, the idea of small children battering each other into submission seems barbaric. But to medieval families, it was the only way to forge the temperament necessary for survival. Over time, these young trainees internalized the lessons. A squire who had endured countless bruises learned to keep his composure under pressure. A boy who had been called a coward in front of his peers would spend years proving his bravery. By adolescence, he would have graduated from wooden weapons to steel, training with real swords that could draw blood. The psychological impact of this upbringing was profound. In letters and memoirs from the later Middle Ages, knights sometimes confessed that their earliest memories were not of parental affection, but of the sting of the practice sword or the roar of a trainer's scorn. They remembered learning to mask pain behind a blank expression, to accept that kindness was rare and that respect had to be earned through endurance. The expectation was that by 14, a boy would be ready to ride into a skirmish if called upon. His childhood, such as it was, had prepared him for the reality that life was fragile and honor was everything. Those who survived this path would eventually be dubbed knights in elaborate ceremonies. They would swear oaths of loyalty and receive the weapons that, years earlier, they had first clutched with trembling hands. When you look at the suits of armor displayed in museums today, gleaming and silent, remember that each one belonged to a man who had been trained from the smallest age to view violence as both duty and destiny. His ability to wield a sword began before he could properly write his own name. That was no accident. It was the deliberate creation of a system that believed a warrior must be shaped long before he became a man. In that world, childhood was brief, innocence was expendable, and the wooden sword was the first lesson in a lifetime of discipline and sacrifice. Girls were trained for marriage at age 7. Girls, born into noble families in medieval Europe, rarely experienced anything resembling what we might call childhood. By the age of 7, a girl's fate was often sealed by ink pressed onto parchment, in contracts negotiated not by her, but around her treaties forged with her body as collateral. This was not the age of innocence, but the age of instruction. She would be dressed in garments that marked her as promised, her hair carefully arranged to signal her status, and her small hands guided to perform gestures of deference she scarcely understood. At 7, she was no longer merely a daughter. She was a future bride, a political instrument to bind families together and secure inheritances. She was often sent away, escorted by attendants and sometimes her own mother, to the household of her betrothed. There, she would be placed under the supervision of the lady of the manor, or a governess, whose duty was to shape her into a woman who would never embarrass her husband's name. She learned to move quietly through corridors, to lower her eyes when men spoke, to accept correction without protest. She was taught to spin, to embroider, to manage servants. She was drilled in the art of obedience. Her mind was furnished with the principles of piety, meekness, and submission, virtues recited like prayers until they replaced whatever instincts she was born with. Marriage itself could come as early as 12, but long before that day, she would be reminded daily that her worth lay in her chastity, her obedience, and her usefulness to her husband's ambitions. Every moment was preparation. Even her posture at the dinner table was corrected, because a noble woman must appear composed at all times. She must not speak too loudly. She must not contradict. She must never, under any circumstance, show defiance. If she did, there were punishments designed to break her spirit. Some were as simple as isolation in a cold chamber. Others were public humiliations in the eyes of her guardians. Such discipline was necessary to shape her into a proper lady. The girls themselves often felt a confusion they could never articulate. Torn from the only home they had known, surrounded by strangers, they learned to hide their grief behind polite smiles. The letters they wrote back to their families were inspected before they were sealed, ensuring no private plea for rescue would reach sympathetic ears. In many cases, the only affection they received came from the wet nurses, who had cared for them in infancy, or from older female servants who remembered what it was to be young and powerless. These arrangements were justified as necessary for stability and prosperity. An alliance between noble houses was not a romantic contract, but a financial and military pact. The girl was part of that transaction, and her education in wifely duties was seen as an investment in the family's future. Love was not part of the equation. Her own desires, her dreams, if she even dared to have them, were irrelevant. Some chroniclers noted that noble girls developed an eerie composure by the time they reached puberty, a stillness in the eyes that came from knowing there was no escape from the life chosen for them. Before they could read their own name. At weddings, these girls stood adorned in fabrics worth a peasant's yearly wage, faces powdered to mask their youth. Beside them, grooms who were often twice their age placed rings on trembling fingers. The priests spoke of holy union, but beneath the ceremony was an unspoken truth. She was there because she had been groomed for this moment since her 7th year. Her dowry was counted, her virginity presumed, her silence assured. Not every marriage was cruel, but even the kindest husband rarely questioned a system that gave him a wife so young she had never known the freedom to choose him. A noble girl's education was complete when she could manage a household and bear heirs without complaint. For this, her childhood was sacrificed. These practices would endure for centuries, defended by kings and clerics alike as the natural order of society. And so, generation after generation, 7-year-old girls learned that their lives did not belong to them. Beatings were a standard parenting tool. Imagine growing up in a world where pain was seen not as a failing of a parent's temper, but as an essential ingredient in a child's moral education. For centuries, corporal punishment was so embedded in daily life that questioning it seemed almost heretical. The phrase, "spare the rod and spoil the child," drawn loosely from the Book of Proverbs, was not just a proverb, was a cultural mandate. In medieval and early modern Europe, a beating was considered a demonstration of love. A parent who refrained from striking a child was accused of neglecting their duty, of allowing vice to flourish unchecked. And so, across all levels of society, from peasant cottages to noble manors, the rod, the birch switch, or the leather strap hung in plain sight, an ever-present reminder that discipline was never far away. Historical records, from court transcripts to household manuals, describe a landscape where physical punishment was often the first and last resort. Children as young as 3 or 4 could be whipped for disobedience, laziness, or simply for failing to memorize their catechism lessons. In many cases, the frequency of beatings was not only accepted, but recorded as a sign of proper upbringing. Manuals, such as the Baby's Book and conduct guides, like A Little Book for Children, made it clear, if you did not correct a child's faults with the rod, you were condemning their soul to ruin. This belief was underpinned by a conviction that children were born in sin, their natural inclinations tending toward wickedness unless broken by force. The rod was not merely a tool for obedience, it was an instrument of salvation. Schools too were notorious for their brutal regimes. Medieval and Renaissance classrooms echoed with the cries of children being flogged. The schoolmaster was often chosen as much for his strength of arm as for his knowledge of Latin grammar. Desks were fitted with leather straps for restraining squirming pupils. Some instructors even kept elaborate canes, each with a nickname and a specific use, one for minor infractions, another for more grievous offenses. To modern eyes, it might look like sadism, but to contemporaries, it was the fulfillment of a sacred trust, the obligation to form a righteous adult from the crooked timber of youth. In homes, beatings often followed a predictable ritual. A parent would recite a short prayer or a moral lesson before administering the blows. This sanctified the act, transforming it from mere violence into a spiritually endorsed correction. The child might be instructed to kneel and confess their fault, and only after this ritualized humiliation would the punishment begin. The frequency and severity varied by household, but the principle remained the same. Pain was necessary, pain was purifying, pain was love. And so, mothers and fathers, often with genuine sorrow in their hearts, raised the rod over their children in the belief that it was an act of mercy. The Church, unsurprisingly, lent its authority to this worldview. Sermons warned parents that sparing the rod would invite God's wrath upon their families. Religious tracts insisted that unchecked childish willfulness could blossom into adult rebellion, threatening not only the household but the entire social order. This was a time when hierarchy and discipline were woven into every layer of society. Kings punished nobles, nobles punished peasants, husbands punished wives, and parents punished children. The rod was not simply a household tool, it was a miniature reflection of the great chain of authority that held civilization together. To question it was to question the entire moral fabric of society. Even the earliest legal codes, from England's common law to continental statutes, gave explicit sanction to corporal punishment within the family. A father's right to chastise his children was nearly absolute, provided he did not maim or kill them. There were cases when neighbors might report excessive brutality, but these were rare and often ignored. Most communities saw intervention as unwarranted meddling. After all, a well-disciplined child was a credit to the neighborhood. An undisciplined one was a future criminal. The logic was chillingly straightforward. Hurt them now, so they will not disgrace you later. One of the most haunting aspects of this era is how children internalized the message. Letters from young apprentices and boarding school pupils reveal how many came to believe that their beatings were deserved, or even necessary. In one 17th century diary, a boy of 10 writes matter-of-factly that he received 20 strokes for failing to recite a psalm. Then adds, "I am glad for it, for my mind is cleared." In another account, a young girl tells her confessor that her mother's punishments made her love her more, because she feared the devil would take her if she were not beaten for her sins. The psychology of the rod was insidious. Pain became intertwined with redemption, and fear became a currency of affection. Over time, some reformers began to question whether this iron regime was truly just. The Enlightenment brought philosophers, like John Locke, who argued that children were not miniature demons, but blank slates shaped by experience. Locke advised parents to use reason and encouragement rather than force. Yet even he did not entirely reject corporal punishment. He merely urged that it be administered sparingly, as a last resort. More radical voices, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, claimed that beatings destroyed the natural goodness of children. But these were exceptions. Well into the 19th century, the rod remained an emblem of righteous authority. Factories and orphanages institutionalized whipping as a daily routine. The Victorian ideal of the strict father owed as much to the medieval rod as it did to any modern philosophy. And yet, even in this world of sanctioned violence, there were moments when the mask slipped, when a child's scream was too piercing, when a mother's hand trembled as she raised the birch, when a father wept afterward in secret. These glimpses of guilt remind us that not all parents were heartless enforcers. Many loved their children desperately, but could not imagine another way to prepare them for life's hardships. In their minds, discipline was not cruelty, it was protection, a hard shield against a harder world. Today, we look back in horror and disbelief. But it is worth remembering that for those who lived it, corporal punishment felt as inevitable as the seasons. It was how virtue was taught, how families kept order, how society reproduced itself. Questioning the rod meant risking your reputation. As a good parent, it meant defying centuries of religious teaching and cultural consensus. And so, the beatings continued, sometimes gentle, sometimes savage, always justified by the belief that without them, children would grow wild and damned. When you hear that beatings were not controversial but expected, understand that this is not an exaggeration. It is a reflection of a civilization that saw the child not as an autonomous being, but as raw material to be shaped by fear, by pain, by the ever-present rod. And in that dark inheritance, you can still feel the echo of all those small bodies trembling. All those small voices whispering prayers that tomorrow, perhaps, the rod would be spared. First words were taught by fear. Imagine the first time a child dared to form words. The moment when a small voice rose up in a medieval hut, or a cramped urban tenement. That moment should have been celebrated, cherished, as proof of growing intellect and spirit. But in much of pre-modern Europe, the first words a child spoke were filtered through a dense fog of fear. In many households, especially among the working poor and peasant families, language itself was a dangerous thing. A child's voice could provoke suspicion, punishment, or humiliation. Parents who lived under oppressive landlords or ecclesiastical authority knew too well that a child who spoke too loudly or asked too many questions could bring ruin upon the entire family. So they trained their little ones early, often before they understood meaning itself, to keep their voices soft and their questions rarer still. It is a chilling truth that medieval and early modern societies saw silence not simply as a virtue, but as a survival skill. Records from parish courts, manorial rolls, and moral instruction manuals are littered with examples of how children were disciplined for speaking out of turn. In many regions, even innocent chatter could be interpreted as insolence. Children were expected to wait to be spoken to, and then to answer humbly in as few words as possible. A child's first sentences often arrived not in joy but in caution, shaped by the constant fear of reprisal. Whispering became an instinct, a reflex formed so early it was almost subconscious. If you were born into a peasant family, your life was a sequence of dangers you had no power to name. Hunger, disease, and the arbitrary violence of feudal lords defined your days. In such a world, parents passed down lessons of deference and obedience as if they were sacred truths. A loud question, "Why do we pay so much grain? Why does the priest curse us?" was not an innocent curiosity but a provocation. The wrong word could be heard by a bailiff or steward and reported. A fine could follow, or worse, a beating. So the first words you learned were often clipped and cautious. By the late Middle Ages, moralists and clergy produced guides for parents instructing them to curb immoderate speech. They claimed that loud children were a sign of bad upbringing, that a child's voice was a mirror of the parent's failure to instill virtue. Mothers were warned that if they allowed their children to chatter or argue, they risked scandal. Fathers were expected to discipline any child who interrupted an elder or offered an opinion unasked. This discipline could be verbal, but it was often physical. Small children were slapped or cuffed for speaking out of turn. Some were made to kneel in corners, mouths bound with rags or stuffed with bitter herbs to cleanse their tongues. The historian Stephen Osmond described how in some German households, silence was enforced through ritual shame. A child who asked questions during meals might be forced to eat alone, or forbidden to eat at all. Others were punished by being ignored for days, their presence unacknowledged, their questions unanswered. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was a defensive strategy. Poor families who could not read or write relied on a delicate web of social standing and compliance. A single misstep and overheard complaint, a child's remark could be taken as evidence of sedition or heresy. So the home became a training ground for the art of submission. Consider the psychological toll of learning to speak in such an atmosphere. For the smallest children, language is meant to be a bridge to understanding, an invitation to connection. But in these communities, language was more often a trap. Children learned to observe every expression, to weigh every word, to rehearse their responses in whispers before daring to speak them aloud. When they did speak, their voices were often thin, uncertain, as if they half expected a blow or a scolding. In reply, this fear left deep traces. Many early autobiographies and letters reveal that adults who grew up in such households described an enduring sense of anxiety whenever they needed to speak publicly. Even among their own families, they struggled to ask questions or express dissent. The habit of whispering remained long after the threat had passed. It was not uncommon for elders to mock the next generation for soft tongues and quavering voices, never pausing to see that those traits were learned in the very crucible of fear they themselves had stoked. Among the nobility, expectations were scarcely kinder, though the penalties differed. Young aristocrats were trained to speak fluently but cautiously. Tutors drilled them to recite only approved words and to never express an unfiltered opinion. In court, a careless sentence could offend a patron or invite gossip. So even the privileged learned early that language must be managed with ruthless care, but for the peasants, the stakes were more immediate. A child's loud question about taxes or tithes could provoke violent retribution. In time, Enlightenment thinkers began to challenge this culture of fear. Philosophers argued that children deserved not only education, but dignity. They denounced the cruelty of making children afraid to speak. But in the villages and fields far from the salons of Paris and London, little changed. Generations continued to teach their children that silence was safety, and curiosity was a threat. If you picture that world now, dark, smoky cottage, a mother hushing her child before the question could even take shape, you glimpse how power shaped language at its roots. How the first words were never just words, but declarations of where you stood in a dangerous social order. The quiet voice of a child was not simply shyness or obedience, it was the echo of centuries of fear, discipline, and survival. Diseases were treated with leeches in the dim chambers of medieval hospitals and the candlelit rooms of early modern homes. A singular vision of medicine reigned supreme, a belief so pervasive that few dared question it, even when it risked the lives of the most vulnerable. This was the conviction that nearly any ailment, from a simple fever to a mortal infection, could be corrected by releasing the body's own blood. To us, it sounds macabre, even absurd. But for centuries, leeching and bloodletting were considered the cornerstone of medical science, and no patient was too delicate to be subjected to this ritual of bleeding. Not even infants who had barely begun to live. The origins of this practice can be traced far back into antiquity, to the theories of Hippocrates and Galen, who argued that the human body was governed by four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Disease, they taught, arose when these humors fell out of balance. Excess blood, in particular, was suspected to be the cause of inflammation, fever, and a host of other ailments. The logical remedy, in the minds of physicians for nearly 2 millennia, was to expel this surplus fluid by any means necessary. So physicians applied scarification blades to open tiny cuts in the skin, allowing blood to drip into waiting basins. But if they desired more subtle extraction, they turned to leeches, small, cold, wriggling creatures that could be placed on a child's soft skin until they engorged themselves with crimson liquid. Leeches were viewed as almost miraculous tools, nature's own precision instruments. Unlike the blade, the leech was believed to remove only the bad blood. Their saliva, it was said, contained purifying substances that drew out corruption. This reasoning persisted for centuries, even when the results were catastrophic. In medieval Europe, a child suffering a high fever might be bled from the jugular vein, or have leeches affixed behind the ears or along the temples. Medical texts advised that bleeding should be performed in proportion to age and strength. But the line between therapeutic and fatal blood loss was easily crossed. One physician's account from the 14th century describes an infant who was bled so repeatedly for convulsions that the child grew limp and cold. Yet the doctors insisted the treatment must continue until the humors were balanced. As the centuries progressed, the obsession with bleeding only deepened. By the 17th and 18th centuries, leeching was seen as a routine household remedy. Families kept jars of leeches in kitchens and sculleries, ready to be applied whenever a child developed a cough or flushed cheeks. The wealthy ordered leeches in bulk from traveling merchants who harvested them from ponds and marshes. Apothecaries stored them in damp linen sacks, sometimes hundreds at a time. It was not uncommon for a single bleeding session to involve dozens of leeches attached to the patient's arms, legs, and neck. There were even elaborate manuals detailing precisely where to place the creatures. The inside of the mouth was considered an effective site for certain fevers, though this carried terrible risks. The leech could detach and slide into the throat, causing the child to choke. More often, the creature would simply cling so stubbornly that removal tore the delicate mucous membrane, leaving a wound that bled uncontrollably. Physicians described these complications with the calm detachment of men who had seen it all too often. Beyond the immediate trauma and danger, leeching carried the ever-present threat of infection. In an era when germ theory was unknown, cleanliness was haphazard at best. Leeches that had fed on a sick person were sometimes used again without sterilization. If bacteria lingered in the jaws of the creature, the next child could contract a virulent infection that no amount of bleeding could cure. Some leeches carried parasites themselves, transmitting diseases from patient to patient like living syringes. And yet, despite all of this, leeching was defended with fervor. Even the most renowned physicians of the Enlightenment swore by its effectiveness. In France, doctors at the Hôtel Dieu Hospital applied leeches to thousands of children each year. Medical journals of the 18th century praised bleeding as the only way to combat the congestions of infancy, especially when mothers were blamed for their children's poor health. A crying toddler, a feverish baby, these were not symptoms to be soothed, but to be purged. This was not confined to Europe. In colonial America, the same practices thrived. In small towns, midwives and doctors alike prescribed leeching as the first line of treatment. Diaries from frontier families recount how, in the dead of winter, leeches had to be thawed over candle flames before being applied to a sick child's skin. The creature would begin to stir and search for warmth, then latch on and begin its work. By the 19th century, leeching reached almost unimaginable proportions. In 1833 alone, France imported over 41 million leeches for medical use. Hospitals maintained entire leech farms to keep up with demand. The treatment became so ubiquitous that public health authorities worried natural leech populations would collapse under the pressure. And still, no one thought to question whether the massive loss of blood was helping or harming. It was not until the rise of modern pathology and the slow acceptance of germ theory that leeching began to decline. Doctors like Pierre Charles, Alexander Louis in France, and William Osler in America started to compile statistical evidence showing that bleeding did not cure pneumonia or fevers, and often worsened them. But traditions die hard. Well into the late 1800s, desperate families continued to summon the physician and the leech jar whenever their children fell ill. To read the letters of parents during these centuries is to encounter a deep, wrenching paradox. They loved their children with a tenderness we would recognize instantly. Yet in their desperation, they consented to a treatment we would now see as a form of sanctioned torture. A mother might hold her screaming child, while the doctor pressed leeches against their skin. She might whisper comfort, her hands trembling, believing with all her heart that this agony was a form of mercy. Today, the thought of leeching an infant is so grotesque, it feels almost mythical. Yet it was a living reality for countless families. It is easy to dismiss the past as barbaric, but these parents were guided by the best knowledge they had, and by the conviction that no price was too high to save a child's life. In the end, the history of leeching is not only a story of misguided science, it is a window into the terrors of illness in a world without antibiotics. without vaccines, without any certainty that a fever would break on its own. And it is a reminder that our own medical practices, too, will someday be judged. Sibling deaths were normalized. Imagine a childhood spent among small, weathered grave markers, each one bearing the name of a brother or sister you barely remember. In medieval and early modern Europe, this was not an unusual tragedy. It was a fact of life so common that it became woven into the fabric of family and community. Today, the death of a child feels like an almost unimaginable catastrophe. But, for centuries, it was a routine sorrow that every household anticipated and accepted with a kind of grim resignation. The statistics themselves are startling. In many parts of Europe, before modern medicine, as many as 1 in 3 children would die before the age of 5. In some outbreaks of plague or fever, entire families lost multiple children within a single season. Parish records in English villages from the 14th and 15th centuries show lines of names, each marked with a cross, recording baptisms and burials, sometimes within the same week. An infant's survival past their first birthday was cause for quiet relief, but never for certainty. Children grew up in houses where the cradle might be reused over and over for new siblings, and where a tiny shroud waited folded in a chest, ready for the next loss. Graveyards were not distant places visited once a year. They were often located within sight of the kitchen door, close enough that children played among the headstones, weaving games between the monuments to those who had come before them and left too soon. What shocks us today is how communities processed this constant grief. Mourning was brief and measured. In many regions, a mother might be expected to return to her household duties within days of burying her child. There were no extended periods of formal mourning clothes for an infant or toddler. Death at a young age was viewed not as a shocking interruption, but as the conclusion of a fragile beginning. In letters from the 17th century, you find a tone that sounds almost cold to modern ears. A father might write that God has seen fit to call to himself our little John, aged 3 years, with no elaborate expressions of heartbreak. This was not because parents felt no love, it was because they had been taught, from their own earliest memories, that life was brief, and that too much lamenting invited spiritual danger. Public displays of grief risked implying that you questioned God's will. In some cultures, especially in parts of rural France and Germany, small tokens or keepsakes were made from the bodies of dead children, locks of hair, miniature portraits, or tiny linen caps preserved in drawers, but even these were kept discreet, folded away as a private memory rather than a public shrine. Children growing up in such households would see these mementos as ordinary as any household object. Over time, this familiarity with death shaped how children understood themselves. A child might know that they were the 4th or 5th born to their mother, with siblings they never met. They learned their names, heard stories of their brief lives, and accepted that their own survival was never promised. In this way, death was not a distant specter, but an ever-present companion. This closeness to mortality had profound effects on how people approached family bonds. Affection was real, but it was also practical. Parents often avoided becoming too attached too quickly, fearing that an early claim on love might only bring more pain. A new baby was welcomed with gratitude, but also with guarded expectation. Only after a child survived several years did families allow themselves the security of imagining a future together. This does not mean parents were unmoved by loss. Diaries and court records reveal private grief that could be overwhelming. A mother might write in secret about dreams in which she saw her dead children waiting at the edge of a field, or calling to her in the night. But outwardly, she would perform her duties, care for surviving children, and accept condolences with composure. This was not indifference, it was a cultural armor that allowed people to keep moving in a world where death never paused. Church rituals reinforced this acceptance. Priests were trained to comfort families, not by offering false hope, but by reminding them that God's plan included suffering and that eternal life promised reunion. In some regions, families were encouraged to baptize a dying child immediately, and then carry it to burial without delay. as though acknowledging the transience of life in the same breath that welcomed it. You can see traces of this mindset in the architecture of old European churches. Small sections of graveyards, sometimes called children's ground, were crowded with little headstones. Families visited them not as a singular traumatic event, but as a part of ordinary life. Children played there, adults passed through on their way to market, and everyone understood that loss was as common as birth. The idea that grief should be private, brief, and composed can feel almost cruel today. But for people who lived with epidemics, famine, and war, there was no other way to endure. If every death brought paralyzing mourning, no family could have continued. And so communities learned to normalize the death of children, to make it bearable through ritual and repetition. To soften the jagged edges by treating it as part of the natural order. When you stand in an old churchyard and read the dates on small gravestones, remember that behind each one was a family who loved, who lost, and who kept going. Their resilience was not born from a lack of feeling, but from necessity. In a time when survival itself was uncertain, grieving to long for each child risked pulling the living into despair. In our modern world, we have the privilege of expecting our children to outlive us. For most of history, that expectation would have been unthinkable. Children learned this truth early, seeing it etched into stone just steps from their door. They grew up beside reminders that life was fleeting, and that every day was a fragile gift that could vanish without warning. That knowledge shaped how they loved, how they prayed, and how they carried themselves in a world that demanded they learn to say goodbye over and over again. Children slept with animals in the cold darkness of medieval Europe. The walls of a peasant's hut were thin barriers against hunger and frost. When you stepped inside, you would smell the sharp musk of straw and animals. Before you saw the rough-hewn beams or the smoke-stained thatch overhead, this was not a place of comfort as we know it today. It was a single chamber where life unfolded without privacy, without distance, and without protection. Children slept here, curled beneath woolen blankets if the family was fortunate enough to own them, but more often simply wrapped in coarse cloth, sharing space with the very creatures that helped them survive. Pigs rooting near the hearth, goats pressed against the walls, chickens roosting in corners. In winter, when temperatures sank low enough to crack the ground outside, these animals were not kept in separate pens. They were brought into the dwelling itself. Their body heat was a kind of insurance against the killing cold. It is difficult now to imagine what it meant for a child to wake in the night and feel the warm bulk of a pig shifting beside them, or to hear the constant bleating of goats just inches from where they lay. This mingling of species was not an accident. It was a strategy born of desperation and necessity. Historians have reconstructed the typical peasant dwelling of the Middle Ages as a single large room, sometimes partitioned by low barriers, but more often left undivided. One hearth, one roof, one space. Here, the family cooked, ate, worked, and slept. The animals that lived with them were vital to survival, providing milk, meat, wool, and eventually money when they could be sold or traded. A pig was often the most valuable possession a peasant might own, worth more than any piece of furniture or tool. And so it was unthinkable to risk letting livestock freeze to death in the barn while humans kept warm indoors. Everyone would huddle together. The cost of this closeness was steep. Children were exposed to parasites and disease that spread easily in such cramped conditions. Fleas, lice, and mites thrived in the straw bedding. The air was heavy with ammonia from manure. Respiratory infections were common, especially in infants and toddlers whose lungs could not withstand the constant damp and filth. Some historians believe that the high rates of child mortality were not only due to malnutrition and poor hygiene, but to the ceaseless contact with animals, carrying pathogens the human body struggled to fight off. Yet for the parents, there was no alternative. The idea of building a separate structure for livestock was a luxury reserved for wealthier farmers or minor nobility. For the vast majority, survival meant sharing every resource. In the depths of winter, a living pig could be the difference between life and death, and the warmth of its body beside a child might prevent frostbite or worse. The boundaries between animal and human blurred out of sheer necessity. Accounts from the period mention that children sometimes formed attachments to the creatures they slept with. A piglet might be treated almost like a sibling, fed scraps by hand, spoken to softly. In the long nights, these small gestures were born of the same tenderness any child would feel toward a living creature. But there was also a harder truth. That same animal would almost certainly be slaughtered come spring. For a child, it was a lesson in impermanence, in the way survival demanded both affection and sacrifice. This constant proximity also shaped the rhythm of daily life. Before dawn, children were expected to help tend the animals they had slept beside. Even the youngest learned to collect eggs, sweep away droppings, and refill troughs. There was no illusion that childhood was a protected stage of innocence. It was a time of labor, of small hands performing tasks essential to the family's welfare. From a modern perspective, it is tempting to see these practices as a mark of neglect or cruelty. But the peasants who lived this way did not have the luxury of choice. Their reality was one of scarcity so severe that every warmth and every mouth had to be counted. A child's memories were formed in this intimate tangle of people and animals, in the knowledge that survival was a communal project shared, not only among humans but with the beasts whose presence was both a blessing and a danger. In the end, the story of children sleeping with animals is not only about poverty, it is about resilience, about the way families adapted to a world that offered them no guarantees. It is about the deep, often unspoken understanding that life was fragile and that every scrap of warmth was precious. For these children, there were no separate worlds of barn and bedchamber. There was only one world, rough and unclean, but bound together by necessity. Play was discouraged in working homes. Imagine a childhood without the bright chaos of toys scattered across the floor. Without the laughter that rises unbidden when children invent their own little worlds. In much of medieval and early modern Europe, that was the norm. Play was not merely discouraged, was viewed with suspicion, or even outright contempt. In households where survival hinged on every able hand, idleness was seen as a moral failing. A child who played instead of worked was wasting time, and wasting time was a sin against God and the family alike. Most children were introduced to labor almost as soon as they could walk, without stumbling. By the age of 5, many were already helping their mothers spin wool, carrying kindling, or watching over even smaller siblings. In agricultural communities, children learned to drive geese to pasture, gather eggs, or pull weeds. Urban children apprenticed early, sweeping shops or running messages for a tradesman. The line between childhood and adulthood blurred almost beyond recognition, because work was the organizing principle of life itself. Survival required constant effort, and the family economy could not afford sentimentality. Clergy and moralists preached that the devil found work for idle hands. Sermons and pamphlets warned that children allowed to run wild in play were in danger of becoming thieves or drunkards later in life. Discipline began with controlling the body, its impulses, its desires for novelty. And this discipline was easiest instilled by putting children to work before their imaginations could roam too far. If a child was caught daydreaming or fashioning a toy from scraps, it was considered evidence of spiritual weakness or lax parenting. Yet even in these households, children's longing for play could not be fully extinguished. In quiet moments, a child might carve a crude doll from a splinter of firewood or fashion a ball by wrapping rags into a tight bundle. Archaeological digs have recovered tiny carved horses and figures made from discarded animal bones, showing that despite relentless labor, the impulse toward creativity found ways to survive. But these makeshift toys were rarely celebrated, if they were tolerated at all. It was only because they cost nothing and could be justified as teaching tools, preparing a boy for farming or a girl for housekeeping. Throughout Europe, manuals for household management emphasized that every waking moment should be accounted for. A 16th century English text advised that children should rise early and busy themselves in honest labors, and not be given to vain pastimes. A German Lutheran pamphlet insisted that play was a nursery of vice. a temptation that trained children to expect leisure they had no right to enjoy. The assumption was clear: every child was a little worker in the making, and the sooner they learned the virtue of toil, the less likely they were to become burdens on the community. Parents enforced this worldview not always from cruelty, but from necessity. In a subsistence economy, even a child's small contributions could mean the difference between enough bread for the winter or a season of gnawing hunger. When famine struck, no one asked whether a 6-year-old was too young to dig potatoes or herd livestock. They simply pressed tiny hands into service because there was no alternative. Play was a luxury reserved for the wealthy noble children whose lives were cushioned by estates and servants. And even among the elite, play was carefully supervised and structured so it could reinforce discipline. The Church's suspicion of play extended beyond the home. Festivals and fairs were often denounced as breeding grounds for sin and disorder. In many regions, authorities enacted laws limiting the days when children could gather for games. Parish records sometimes list fines levied against families whose children were caught playing in churchyards or streets. In cities like London, children were periodically rounded up and whipped to discourage idle gathering. From the pulpit to the courthouse, the message was the same: play is wasteful, work is righteous. Yet human nature is stubborn. Even the most rigorously controlled households could not fully suppress the spirit of play. Accounts survive of children stealing moments between chores to race in the fields or chase a hoop down a muddy lane. Older siblings might carve toys in secret as gifts. Some families, despite social pressures, found ways to honor small joys: a wooden doll at Christmastide, a cloth ball passed hand to hand when the master was not watching. These were acts of quiet rebellion against a system that measured worth in labor alone. By the 18th century, philosophers began to question whether the suppression of play was truly beneficial. Thinkers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued that children learned through imitation and exploration. They proposed that play was not merely distraction but a way to cultivate curiosity and resilience. But such ideas took time to spread, and in working-class homes, the old suspicion of play endured. Industrialization only deepened the pattern. In factories and mines, children as young as 4 or 5 worked 12-hour shifts. If they played, it was in stolen moments, snatching a game of jacks or marbles during a brief meal break. For centuries, the prevailing belief remained that idleness bred vice, and play was its most dangerous form. To look back is to understand how thoroughly necessity can shape culture. A childhood without toys was not a quirk of poverty, was the expected price of survival. Even the scraps children used to fashion playthings: bones, sticks, rags, a story of ingenuity struggling against the iron discipline of labor. Today, when we see a child playing freely, we take it almost for granted that play is a right. But behind that right stands the memory of generations who were told that happiness must be earned, that delight was a sin if it interfered with duty. In those long hours of work, in the silent sorrow of watching other children laugh while your own hands blistered, an unspoken longing survived, a hope that someday someone would declare that childhood was worthy of joy. Apprenticeship was a legal ownership. Imagine being 7 years old, small enough that your head barely reaches an adult's chest, and hearing your parents explain that tomorrow you will no longer belong to them. Tomorrow you will belong to someone else, a craftsman you've never met, whose workshop smells of hot iron and sweat and old straw. In medieval Europe, and long after, this was not a rare tragedy or the result of poverty alone. It was the expected path for children of ordinary families. An apprenticeship was seen as a contract that transformed a child into legal property. Not a son or daughter to be cherished under the same roof, but a body to be trained, corrected, and exploited as the master saw fit. The ritual began with the indenture contract. Families desperate for security, or hoping to improve their child's fortunes, signed documents that read with chilling clarity. In these legal texts, parents gave their child to the master, who agreed to train them in a trade in return for obedience, labor, and subordination. Once signed, the agreement was binding. The child could not simply return home if frightened or ill. A master held not only practical authority, but near total power over that child's body and time. In many towns, local law treated an apprentice closer to a ward or even a chattel servant than an independent human being. Children were often apprenticed as young as 7 or 8, though some contracts began later, at 10 or 12. In England, France, and parts of Germany, apprenticeship was the most common way boys and, sometimes girls, learned to survive outside agriculture. Parents believed they were giving their children a future, and sometimes that was true. A skilled trade could lift a family from subsistence into modest prosperity. But for countless others, apprenticeship was an unending season of hunger, fear, and drudgery. Once a child crossed the threshold of the master's workshop, everything changed. The rhythms of home were gone. Days began before dawn. A boy might wake to sweep ashes from the hearth, carry water, polish tools, and stoke forges. An apprentice baker was expected to tend ovens through the night so bread would be ready for the morning market. In busy guild cities, some masters kept dozens of apprentices and journeymen crowded into small sleeping lofts, where lice and damp straw were constant companions. Discipline was often brutal. Historical court records are filled with grim examples. Masters who beat children with sticks or iron rods for clumsiness, who withheld meals for days as punishment, who locked a child in a cellar for crying or speaking without permission. In London, in the 14th century, city ordinances had to be passed forbidding masters from beating apprentices to death. A prohibition that tells you precisely how common such violence was, and even when masters were less cruel, the sheer exhaustion of endless work wore a child down. Apprentices had little recourse. Their contracts usually lasted 7 years, but in some cases, the term extended to 14. If a child ran away, the law treated them as fugitives. Notices were nailed to church doors and town gates describing their height, clothing, and hair color, offering rewards for their return. A runaway apprentice who was caught could be dragged back by force and then subjected to even harsher discipline for daring to escape. Why did society accept this? Partly, it was the belief that work was salvation, that idleness corrupted youth, and that strict oversight was necessary to build moral character. Partly, it was economic. Masters needed cheap labor, and parents often needed the small payments or future security that an apprenticeship promised. But underlying all of this was a darker truth. A child was not seen as an autonomous being. They were a commodity in a transactional system. Their will was something to be shaped, subdued, and, eventually, replaced with obedience. Not every apprenticeship was a nightmare. Some masters genuinely cared for their charges and treated them almost as foster children. Records survive of apprentices inheriting tools or shops when a childless master died. A skilled, well-treated apprentice might earn good wages and marry into respectable society. But these stories of benevolence existed alongside thousands of other stories of children who worked themselves into illness or whose growth was stunted by malnutrition and overwork. Girls apprenticed to seamstresses, spinners, or domestic mistresses were especially vulnerable. They not only labored for long hours, but also faced the threat of exploitation and abuse. Some cities attempted to regulate the treatment of female apprentices, but enforcement was rare, and complaints often disappeared behind closed doors. By the 17th century, new debates began to stir. Humanist thinkers and reformers argued that children were more than labor. They deserved education, humane treatment, and protection from cruelty. Manuals began to appear that warned masters not to break a child's spirit or to deny them rest and nourishment. But tradition was slow to fade. In rural districts, the same harsh customs lingered well into the 1800s. Imagine for a moment what it felt like to be 8 years old and realize that you could no longer speak freely, no longer choose when to sleep or when to eat. To know that any protest or longing for home could be answered with a slap or worse. For these children, apprenticeship was not simply a training in craft, it was a training in submission. A slow, daily lesson in who held power and who did not. Some apprentices found resilience in this world. They formed secret friendships, carved their initials into beams and workbenches, and dreamed of the day they would be free. Others never made it that far. In coroner's rolls, you will find them listed as names with no ages, no terse phrases, died of neglect, starved, broken bones. Today, apprenticeship has evolved into something safer, structured around learning rather than ownership. But the shadows of the old system remain in the archives, hundreds of thousands of contracts that reduce children to property. If you listen closely to those records, you can almost hear the echoes. The crack of a master's stick, the whisper of a child too tired to speak, the silent hope that someday their labor would be over and they would belong to themselves again. Punishment for disobedience included fire exposure in the dim half-lit rooms of medieval households. Discipline was not simply a matter of a stern word or a slap on the wrist. It was often a ritual of intimidation, a calculated spectacle, designed to brand obedience into the minds of children. The idea that a child could be reformed through the deliberate infliction of fear and pain was woven into the fabric of everyday life. Among the most haunting methods recorded were punishments involving fire and exposure to cold. These were not punishments meted out to hardened criminals but to children, some barely old enough to form sentences. In many regions of Europe, records and private diaries describe caretakers who held disobedient children near open flames. Their faces turned toward the heat until their skin flushed and tears began to pour. In some cases, a child was forced to extend a hand perilously, close to the fire's edge, stopping just short of a burn. The lesson burned into memory rather than flesh. The belief behind such practices was that fear of bodily harm was the surest way to instill discipline. A child who had felt the searing threat of flame, or the freezing bite of mud in winter, was thought to carry that lesson in their bones. It was a time when children were seen not as innocents to be protected, but as miniature sinners whose wills must be broken early. If a child refused to eat, or defied an order, or cried too long, it was not uncommon for parents to force them to walk barefoot through icy puddles, or to stand outside in the snow as punishment. Some parish records in Northern Europe mention children who were made to kneel on cold flagstones for hours. Others describe households where fire exposure was considered a measured corrective, a controlled ordeal to purge defiance. Observers who documented these acts often did so with unsettling neutrality, as if they were recording the weather. In their accounts, there is little sense of outrage, only the conviction that such methods were ordinary. A priest in 15th century Germany wrote of visiting a home where a child was being held near the hearth for refusing to recite prayers. The priest did not intervene. He merely noted that the child's screams subsided into sobs, and afterward, she never again failed to obey. These practices were part of a larger culture that regarded children as property, subject to the will of their elders. Disobedience was viewed as a spiritual failing, a gateway to greater sins if left unchecked. In a world where survival demanded strict hierarchies, the harshest punishments were often justified as necessary. Parents believed that any cruelty was preferable to raising an adult who would bring shame or ruin to the family. Fire, in particular, had a symbolic power. It represented not just pain but purification. The threat of the flame was a threat of moral cleansing. To hover a child's hand over the embers was to warn that the fires of hell itself awaited those who defied authority. Such imagery was reinforced by sermons that likened disobedient children to kindling ready to be consumed by divine wrath. Even in private homes, this theology of fear shaped the smallest acts of discipline. But not all observers accepted these punishments without question. In the 17th century, some moralists began to write pamphlets condemning excessive cruelty. They argued that while discipline was necessary, it should not deform the spirit or body. Yet these voices were few, and their influence limited. For most families, the ritual of fire and ice continued generation after generation. The cold mud, too, served its own function. In villages where winters were long and bitter, a barefoot walk through frozen muck was a potent humiliation. The physical shock drove the lesson deeper than any lecture. The child would remember the sting of freezing mud creeping up their legs, the way their toes turned numb as they were ordered to stand motionless. When they were finally allowed back inside, the relief of warmth became inseparable from the memory of submission. As modern eyes look back on these practices, it is tempting to dismiss them as monstrous aberrations. Yet they were woven into the ordinary fabric of family life. The same hands that lifted a child tenderly to bed could the next day force them to kneel before a hearth in terror. In this paradox lies one of the most unsettling truths about history, that cruelty and care often existed side by side. Today, scholars comb old court records and diaries to reconstruct these punishments in detail. They find evidence not only of the physical consequences, burns, frostbite, scars, but also of the psychic wounds. A child taught that love and pain were inseparable often carried that lesson into adulthood, reproducing the cycle in the next generation. The long shadow of such practices can still be traced in cultural attitudes that glorify harsh discipline as character building. But to truly understand the past, we must look without flinching at the moments when power was enforced through fear and the threat of flame. Only then can we see how the line between care and cruelty was drawn and redrawn over centuries. Children were married before puberty. Imagine a child barely old enough to hold a quill steadily, sitting beside her father as he signs away her future with a flourish of ink. In the great halls of medieval Europe, childhood was not a sanctuary of innocence, it was a negotiation. Among the noble families who ruled the castles and estates, marriage was not the culmination of a love story. It was a transaction sealed by alliances, guaranteed by dowries, and often arranged before a girl's body had even begun to mature. Throughout the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, marriage contracts were signed between families when the children involved were astonishingly young. In France and England, girls as young as 7 were betrothed, and in some cases, legally married before reaching puberty. The idea was simple: cement loyalty, secure property, and ensure that no rival house could claim the same strategic bond. Whether the bride understood or even comprehended what was happening was rarely considered relevant. Legal frameworks for these child marriages were remarkably well defined. Canon law, which governed much of Europe's marriage practices, recognized the concept of marriage per verbum futuru, a betrothal made in the future tense. This agreement was binding, if confirmed later, by both parties. But even more binding was marriage per verba de presenti, a contract in the present tense that could be made by children old enough to speak the vows, typically around age 7. From that moment, the marriage was recognized as valid in the eyes of the church and the law, even if consummation was deferred until puberty. For noble families, the stakes were too high to leave such matters to chance. A daughter represented a vital asset, means to acquire land, secure peace treaties, or gain favor with a powerful overlord. As soon as a girl was born, calculations began. What alliances would be possible in 10 or 15 years? Which rivalries could be softened by offering her hand? The family's fortunes, and sometimes its survival, depended on these decisions. Consider Eleanor of Provence, married to Henry III of England. Their negotiations began when she was a child. Or Margaret Beaufort, whose marriage to Edmund Tudor was arranged before she reached her teenage years. She became pregnant at 12, and nearly died giving birth. These were not isolated examples. Across Europe, chronicles record the same pattern repeating in castle after castle. Girls contracted into unions before they knew what marriage truly meant. For the girls themselves, life after betrothal often shifted immediately. A child bride might be sent to live in her future husband's household, not as a wife in the full sense, but as a symbol of the alliance. There, she would be raised under the watchful eyes of her in-laws, learning their customs and proving her family's loyalty through her obedience. Chroniclers describe how such girls, barely past the age of dolls, were trained in courtly manners, household management, and religious piety, all in preparation for a role they could not fully understand. The rituals surrounding these marriages could be elaborate. Engagement ceremonies sometimes featured symbolic exchanges of rings or gifts. In France, the espousals could include feasts and processions. But beneath the pageantry lay a stark reality. The child had no real choice. Even when the church insisted on verbal consent, the pressure to comply was immense. To refuse was to risk disgrace, not only for herself, but for her entire lineage. Once puberty arrived, consummation often followed quickly. In some cases, consummation was delayed until the girl was considered physically ready. But this standard varied wildly by region and by the ambitions of her family. Medical knowledge was rudimentary. The risks of early pregnancy were poorly understood or simply ignored in the pursuit of securing heirs. Records reveal the tragic consequences: young girls who died in childbirth, who suffered permanent injuries, or who were widowed before reaching adulthood. Yet to the society around them, none of this seemed extraordinary. Marriage was not primarily about companionship. It was about continuity. Property needed heirs. Titles needed legitimate descendants. Alliances needed public proof. The girl's body became the vessel through which all these ambitions were fulfilled. Among the nobility, the anxiety over lineage was relentless. If a rival house married a desirable heiress, your claim to a region or title could be weakened overnight. This fear drove families to act swiftly, contracting children into unions that might not be consummated for years but were legally binding. From the first handshake, the emotional cost was rarely recorded. Letters and chronicles seldom linger on the inner lives of child brides. But in rare glimpses, you can sense the dissonance: a girl writing in a shaky hand about leaving her mother's side, or a young bride recounting the terror of her wedding night. These fragments remind us that behind the polished treaties and Latin legal phrases were children who had no power to refuse. While today, marriage is imagined as an act of love and personal choice, in the medieval world, it was often closer to an inheritance contract. A girl could be legally wed before her first period, expected to carry on her husband's name before she fully understood her own. The solemnity of the church and the force of custom left her no alternative. This was not seen as cruelty, it was the practical application of survival in a world where dynasties rose and fell on the strength of alliances. To question the practice was to challenge an entire system of order. Even reformers who criticized abuses of marriage seldom challenged the idea of child betrothal itself. Over centuries, as legal standards evolved and Enlightenment ideas about childhood began to spread, societies slowly recognized the dangers of early marriage. But in medieval Europe, it was simply the way of things, a custom so normal it did not need justification. Families calculated, alliances shifted, and children carried the burden of choices made long before they could speak for themselves. When you walk through the ruins of an old castle or stand in a cathedral where these marriages were blessed, remember that many of the alliances that shaped history began with a contract signed over the cradle of a child who could not yet read her own name. The stones remember. The records remain. And in their silent testimony, we see how power and survival eclipsed the voices of the very young. Children witnessed public executions as morality lessons in medieval and early modern Europe. The notion of justice was not confined to dusty courtrooms or the ink of scribes. Justice was a spectacle, raw, public, and unflinching. When a man or woman was sentenced to die, the execution was staged deliberately in full view of the townspeople. And among the crowds who gathered to watch, children stood shoulder to shoulder with their elders, their small faces turned upward to witness scenes most of us could hardly imagine. It was not simply that children happened to be present by accident. They were often brought deliberately by parents, teachers, or clergy, who believed that watching a body swing from the gallows was a necessary education. In their minds, this was not an act of cruelty but a civic duty, a lesson in the consequences of sin and the certainty of punishment. The executioner's work became a moral theater, and the children were expected to absorb its message. Market days were commonly chosen for executions, when the largest number of people would be present. A scaffold was erected in the main square, often near the church or the Gebeld. The condemned was paraded through the streets, surrounded by guards, sometimes forced to wear a placard describing their crime. Children watched from doorways or from the shoulders of their fathers. They heard the jeers of the crowd, smelled the tang of sweat and fear, and saw firsthand the transformation of a living person into a lifeless object of warning. The authorities did not shy away from the spectacle's grisly details. In fact, they emphasized them. After a hanging or beheading, the severed head might be placed on a spike over the town gate. Bodies were left to rot in gibbets at crossroads, slowly collapsing under the sun and rain so that every passerby, child or adult, would be confronted with the sight and smell of decaying flesh. These images were intended to etch themselves into memory. Justice was not simply a word, it was something you could see, something you could not forget. Parents told their children that such punishments were the price of wickedness, the wages of crime, the fate of the unrepentant. A mother might lift her child to see over the heads of the crowd and whisper, "This is what happens to thieves." A father might point to the blackened skull on a spike and say, "Remember this when you attempted to lie or steal." The lessons were not abstract. They were as real as the blood on the scaffold. Some chroniclers describe children who became visibly distressed, weeping or trembling as the executioner carried out his duty. Others grew fascinated, pressing closer to see each detail. There were no protective screens, no concessions to the sensitivities of youth. Exposure to death was considered part of growing up, a proof that a child was ready to face the realities of the world. Clergy too played a role in framing these events as moral instruction. Sermons were preached from the steps of the scaffold, proclaiming that God's justice had been done. The condemned was urged to confess, to beg forgiveness, to warn the onlookers not to follow the same path. Children were expected to take these lessons to heart. Yet beneath the official narrative of moral education, there was another reality. Public executions could brutalize as much as they instructed. Witnessing a hanging or a drawing and quartering did not always produce virtue. It could dull empathy, breed fear, or inspire a morbid curiosity that lingered long after the crowd dispersed. In some cases, children were known to mimic what they had seen, playing games that reenacted the scaffold or the noose. The state, however, believed the benefits outweighed the risks. In an age when crime was often met with swift and lethal punishment, deterrence was paramount. A generation raised to fear the executioner would, it was assumed, be less inclined to break the law. Heads on spikes were less about vengeance than about control, about shaping the minds of children, as much as punishing the bodies of criminals. By modern standards, the practice seems grotesque. We struggled to comprehend a society that normalized such violence, that saw no contradiction between protecting children and parading them before the scaffold. But for centuries, this was simply how justice was done. It was not hidden behind closed doors, because it was meant to be remembered. Every child who passed beneath a row of severed heads was reminded that order was maintained, not by kindness, but by fear. These spectacles have long vanished from our streets, but their echoes remain in the ways we still debate punishment and deterrence, and when we look back, we are forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The line between teaching and traumatizing was never as clear as our ancestors believed. Educational beatings were common. Imagine sitting in a dim, drafty classroom, where the smell of ink mingled with damp straw and the sharp temps of fear. You are only 7 or 8 years old, but your day has already begun before dawn. You have recited your morning prayers and trudged through muddy lanes to reach the schoolhouse. Single room with benches crowded shoulder to shoulder, a blackboard smudged with chalk, and at the front, the schoolmaster's desk. But the most important object in the room isn't the lectern or the books. It is the birch rod hanging on a hook, always within reach. For centuries, educational beatings were not only accepted, but expected. Discipline was inseparable from learning. Pain was the price you paid for knowledge. The practice was rooted in the belief that children were inherently disobedient and that their wills must be broken early if they were to become virtuous adults. The Church, which controlled most of medieval education, encouraged this view with the same zeal it applied to all forms of discipline. Ecclesiastical schools, some attached to monasteries, some to cathedrals, were training grounds for future clergy and scribes. Latin was the foundation of learning, and the slightest mistake was seen as proof of moral laxity. Mispronounce a declension, fail to conjugate a verb properly, or falter during recitation, and you would feel the sting of the rod on your back or your palms. The humiliation was part of the lesson. Pain did not simply correct error, it purified the spirit. Manuals for schoolmasters detailed precisely how and when to use corporal punishment. The birch rod was preferred because it was flexible and inflicted sharp, memorable pain without breaking the skin. Some teachers kept several rods, each suited to a different offense. A minor slip in grammar might earn a few brisk strokes across the hand. A lapse in attention or disrespectful tone could provoke a more severe beating across the shoulders or buttocks. The medieval classroom was a place where boys were taught to associate learning with vigilance and vigilance with fear. In many schools, punishment was ritualized. Before the rod descended, the pupil would be commanded to kneel, confess the fault, and recite a prayer for humility. Sometimes the entire class was forced to watch, the better to learn by example. Chronic offenders might be beaten so frequently that their peers could read the marks through their thin woolen tunics. The discipline was not limited to physical pain. Shame was a constant companion. Students were often forced to wear dunce caps, or stand in corners holding signs that declared them fools. In some schools, boys were tied to pillars or locked in wooden stocks if they failed to meet the master's standards. The culture of punishment extended far beyond grammar schools. Universities like Oxford and Paris were notorious for their harsh discipline. Even young men studying philosophy or theology could be flogged for breaches of conduct. But it was in the earliest stages of education that beatings left the most lasting scars. Diaries and letters from the period reveal how students internalized this brutality. One boy wrote that he feared the rod more than the fires of hell itself, and that he prayed each night for the strength to remember his lessons perfectly so he would not be shamed the next morning. Parents seldom intervened. In fact, many insisted that teachers spare no rod in driving ignorance out of their sons. A schoolmaster who failed to keep order was accused of failing both the children and God. The notion that gentleness might nurture learning was alien to most medieval educators. Instead, obedience was prized above all else. If knowledge came at the cost of fear and pain, it was considered a bargain well struck. The birch rod became a symbol of authority, sometimes elevated almost to an icon. In some schools, it was carried in processions on holy days, a reminder to students that discipline was divine. Statutes governing cathedral schools spelled out in detail that beatings were a duty, not merely a right. Even prominent scholars, men whose names are still cited in histories of education, defended the practice as essential to forming upright Christians and loyal subjects. Yet beneath this grim order, children found ways to rebel or endure. Some learned to hide mistakes by copying from classmates or bribing older boys to help them memorize texts. Others developed stoicism beyond their years, learning to stand without crying as the rod came down. A few ran away, choosing a life on the streets over the unending regimen of beatings and humiliation. But for most, there was no escape. School attendance was a privilege, and the threat of ignorance was as terrifying as the rod itself. As Europe began to move into the Renaissance, a handful of voices started to question whether relentless flogging truly produced wise or moral men. Humanist educators argued that children learned better when they loved their lessons. Figures like Erasmus condemned excessive cruelty, suggesting that fear crushed the natural curiosity needed for scholarship. Yet even Erasmus admitted that some measure of corporal correction was necessary. In practice, the old ways persisted. Well into the 18th century, educational beatings remained standard in much of Europe. Today, when we imagine a classroom, we think of curiosity and encouragement. But in the medieval world, education was a crucible where discipline was forged through pain. Each stroke of the birch rod was meant to carve virtue into the flesh. When you read that learning and pain went hand in hand, understand that this was no exaggeration. It was a reality so ingrained that generations of boys believed knowledge itself could not exist without suffering. They learned to conjugate Latin verbs with tears in their eyes, to recite holy texts while their hands burned, to equate scholarship with fear. And in those long, silent hours when the rod waited overhead, a lesson was taught more lasting than any grammar, that in their world, obedience was worth any price. Boys were taught to fight before they could write. Imagine a grand hall lit by flickering torches, the walls hung with banners showing lions and hawks, swords and spears crossed above vast hearths. In the center of that hall, a small boy no older than 5 stands barefoot on the cold stone. He holds a wooden sword almost too heavy for his arms. His tutor, an older man in leather armor, circles him with a measuring stare. This is not a game. This is the first lesson in a lifelong education where letters and books come second to the art of violence. For much of medieval and early modern Europe, noble boys were taught to fight before they could write. To modern minds, it feels almost inverted. Should an literacy connection to knowledge and culture be the cornerstone of an education? But for aristocratic families, the answer was simple. Power did not flow from the page. It flowed from the blade. Landed wealth, feudal titles, and family survival all depended on a nobleman's ability to lead men into battle. So, from their earliest years, boys were trained to wield weapons and subdue enemies. Historical records show that in households from England to France, noble children were assigned squires or men-at-arms as tutors. These men had little interest in alphabets. Their charge was to mold a child's body, to harden muscles and perfect reflexes. Training often began as soon as a boy could walk steadily. At 5 or 6, boys were given toy swords made of wood or blunt iron. They were taught the stances guard positions, lunges blocks long before they were taught to read or write their own names. In royal courts, mornings often began with physical drills. A boy would rise before dawn and spend hours practicing strikes and footwork. Some were given small shields to balance on extended arms to build strength. Others were ordered to run laps around courtyards in armor scaled to their size. The idea was not simply to produce skill, but to instill discipline and endurance. Literacy, by contrast, was a luxury, something that could wait until a child was older, if it came at all. Consider the example of Henry, the young King of England, who in the 12th century was praised for his jousting prowess before he was ever expected to study Latin. Chronicles recorded that he could unhorse grown men at tournaments while still barely able to read official proclamations. In many noble families, a boy who showed reluctance in combat was a source of shame. Parents feared that a son who loved books more than swords would be mocked as weak, unworthy of inheritance. The consequences of this emphasis were profound. A child's first lessons were not gentle or abstract. They were lessons in aggression. Boys were expected to learn to strike without hesitation, to parry without fear, to endure pain without tears. Failure often brought humiliation or corporal punishment. A young noble who flinched during sparring drills could expect a public scolding. Some were beaten with wooden staves to toughen them, or locked in armories overnight as punishment for cowardice. Meanwhile, literacy was postponed. If a boy learned letters at all, it was often from a priest or a hired clerk who came in the afternoons after sword practice, writing lessons, and hunting exercises. For many, the alphabet remained a secondary concern well into adolescence. Some noblemen reached adulthood, able to read only simple charters or signatures. This was not seen as shameful. It was simply the natural order. A lord's duty was to defend land and family through force. The work of reading and writing could be delegated to clerks and stewards. And yet, there was a quiet cost to this imbalance. For all the discipline and strength it produced, this martial focus often left noble boys emotionally stunted and intellectually limited. Chroniclers from the 13th century onward remarked on the ignorance that flourished among the aristocracy. When literacy did appear, it was usually practical, enough to sign a decree or read an order of battle. Poetry, philosophy, and scholarship were rare pursuits. Parents justified this by pointing to the ever-present threat of war. Medieval Europe was a tapestry of rival claims and constant skirmishes. A nobleman could not afford to raise a son unfit for the saddle or the sword, but in private, some mothers grieved that their children grew up without gentleness or curiosity. Letters survive in which noble women begged their husbands to allow tutors to spend more time on reading and prayer. These appeals were often ignored. Training was relentless. At 7 or 8, a boy might be sent to live in another lord's household as a page. There, he would learn courtly manners but also hone combat skills. By 12, he would be promoted to squire, responsible for maintaining armor and weapons. Only after years of service and hundreds of hours of drills would he be dubbed a knight. At no stage was literacy the priority. Even the page's lessons in courtly behavior, bowing, dancing, speaking politely, came after the lessons in fighting. In contrast, peasant children, though largely illiterate themselves, were at least spared this organized indoctrination into violence. They learned the trades of survival, planting, harvesting, mending tools. They might never learn to read, but they were not expected to master killing. For noble children, however, the burden of violence was inescapable. Imagine what it felt like to have your earliest memories be of aching arms and bruised knuckles. To know that your worth was measured by how well you struck or how long you endured pain. To watch grown men watch you, not with tenderness, but with cold assessment. Would you be strong enough? Would you be ruthless enough? By the Renaissance, attitudes began to shift. Humanist scholars argued that a noble education should include letters, history, and moral philosophy. Some aristocratic families embraced these ideas, hiring private tutors who taught Latin alongside swordsmanship. But even then, the old ideal persisted that a man must be ready to fight before he was ready to read. In times of crisis, the pen could be set aside, the sword could not. Today, we tend to romanticize the image of the young knight, the page with shining armor, the squire tending the warhorse. But beneath that romantic sheen was a childhood carved by fear, discipline, and the expectation of violence. While other children learned lullabies and letters, noble boys learned to strike and conquer. Their first lessons were not about understanding the world, but about subduing it. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the clash of wooden swords, the barked commands, the steady thump of small bodies hitting the ground. Those sounds were the soundtrack of an upbringing where combat came first, and literacy, if it came at all, was an afterthought. It is a reminder that power shapes not only what we learn, but how soon we are taught to wield force. Long before we are taught to question it. Girls were taught silence as survival, from the moment a girl was old enough to lace her shoes or plait her hair without help. She began to learn that her voice was something dangerous, something that must be softened or silenced if she wished to survive. Across much of medieval and early modern Europe, silence was not merely a virtue for girls, it was a necessity, an unspoken code of self-preservation etched into every hour of their upbringing. At an age when boys were encouraged to practice debate and learn the art of command, girls were taught the inverse lesson, that the less they said, the safer they were. By 6 or 7, most daughters of respectable households had already memorized the protocols of submission. They were instructed to keep their eyes lowered in the presence of a man, whether he was father, brother, priest, or stranger. Eye contact was considered a mark of insolence, even seduction. A girl who dared to look directly at a man risked being labeled impudent, or worse, morally suspect, so they learned to keep their gaze trained on the floor, to speak only in whispers when spoken to fold their hands and wait for commands rather than seeking any autonomy. These expectations were not simply customs, they were reinforced by religious teaching, social pressure, and, if necessary, corporal punishment. Sermons delivered from pulpits insisted that a woman's greatest virtue was humility. Proverbs, repeated by mothers and grandmothers, warned that a loud-tongued daughter would bring shame to her family. In some regions, this ideal of feminine silence was so pervasive that entire manuals were written to instruct parents precisely how to train their daughters. One such guide from the 16th century advised that a girl's tongue should be bridled as one bridles a restless colt. If she protested, she was to be reminded that obedience was not optional, it was her highest calling. In wealthier households, girls were drilled daily in this discipline. They rehearsed how to enter a room without attracting notice, how to rise and curtsy, how to answer in a tone neither too eager nor too hesitant. Silence became a currency, sign of refinement that could one day help secure a husband of respectable standing. The irony was that the very qualities most prized in a wife, meekness, pliability, quiet, were also those that left women most vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. A girl who never learned to protest or question was a girl who would later be expected to endure whatever fate chose to impose on her. Among the peasantry, the expectations were no less rigid, though the stakes were different. For working families, a daughter's silence was considered essential to household order. A girl who asked too many questions or voiced complaints risked being beaten or shamed publicly. The fear of punishment made many girls retreat into themselves. They learned to read the smallest shifts in mood, the tightening of a father's jaw, the heavy footfall of an angry brother, and to adjust their behavior instantly to avoid conflict. But this enforced silence was about more than individual discipline. It was a mechanism of control that reached into every corner of a girl's life. When marriage negotiations began, often before a girl had reached puberty, her opinion was rarely solicited. Fathers or uncles met behind closed doors to decide her future. If she had any feelings on the matter, she was expected to swallow them. One chronicler in 15th century England recorded the words of a mother advising her daughter before a betrothal: "What you feel is of no account. You shall learn to be content, or you shall learn to suffer." This stark philosophy left little room for complaint. Even girls who were sent away to serve in wealthier homes as maids were reminded that their worth depended on obedience. Speaking out of turn could mean dismissal or worse, accusations of theft or impropriety that might follow them for life. The lesson was painfully clear. Survival was bound to silence. To be loud, opinionated, or assertive was to invite ruin. Yet within this enforced quiet, girls developed their own hidden languages. In the margins of prayer books, they scribbled their private thoughts. They whispered confidences to sisters in the dark. They learned to communicate through gesture, glances, and coded phrases, small acts of resistance that allowed them to preserve a sense of self even as the world demanded their submission. Historians have found traces of these secret expressions in letters, diaries, and court records. Occasionally, a woman who had spent her girlhood in near total silence would defy expectation and speak boldly, often in the most desperate circumstances. One 17th century court case describes a young wife who had never contradicted her husband until the day he tried to sell her dowry land without her consent. In that moment, she rose to her feet, fixed her eyes on the magistrate, and spoke in a voice that witnesses described as trembling but unbroken. The shock in the courtroom was palpable. Here was a woman who had been trained all her life to be silent, finally finding her voice. But such moments were rare exceptions. For most girls, the habit of silence became so ingrained that even when opportunities for freedom arose, they hesitated to seize them. The fear of judgment, of being labeled unnatural or wicked, often outweighed any hope of change. And so, generation after generation, daughters were taught the same lesson: that speaking could cost them everything, while silence at least offered the illusion of safety. When we look back on these histories, it is tempting to imagine we have moved beyond such strictures, yet echoes of this training persist. Even today, girls in many cultures are praised for being quiet, agreeable, and modest, while their assertive counterparts are called unruly or difficult. The legacy of silence is not easily erased. It lingers in the way women hesitate to speak, in meetings, in the way they apologize before voicing an opinion, in the way they measure every word for fear of reproach, in remembering the generations who learned silence as a survival strategy. We are reminded that the power to speak has never been given freely. It has always been claimed at a cost. And for countless girls throughout history, the cost of speaking was simply too high to pay. Children were blamed for misfortune. Imagine being a child whose every misstep, every illness, Every unlucky birth was quietly recorded in the minds of neighbors who believed you carried a curse. In medieval and early modern Europe, this was not a superstition whispered only in remote villages. It was a pattern of fear and blame that pervaded everyday life. When crops failed, when cattle sickened, when storms flattened entire harvests, communities often searched for someone to hold responsible, and more often than we care to admit, that someone was a child. The idea that children could embody divine displeasure was rooted in religious belief and reinforced by desperation. In a time when famine could mean death, and the boundaries between natural disaster and spiritual punishment were thin, the line between suspicion and accusation was almost invisible. If a child was born out of wedlock, the risk of being singled out was even higher. The Church taught that sin invited God's wrath, and nothing symbolized sin more publicly than an illegitimate birth. From parish records to sermons, we find evidence that families carrying the stigma of bastardy lived under constant scrutiny. A failed harvest was rarely accepted as mere chance. People looked for patterns, for proof that someone's hidden sins had invited disaster. A sickly, silent child born to an unmarried mother might be regarded with suspicion before he could even walk. The neighbors might say he was marked by God's displeasure. A series of bad seasons could escalate these suspicions into conviction. Accounts survive of villages where entire households were shunned because of a child's birth status. Chroniclers in parts of Germany and England recorded that such children were referred to as tokens of divine anger, living proof that moral failing had infected the community. And when misfortune struck, it was easier to point at a vulnerable child than accept the randomness of disease or weather. These beliefs had ancient roots. Medieval Europe inherited centuries of folk religion and pre-Christian superstition layered under Christian theology. The notion that an unlucky birth could warp the fortunes of a farm was an old one. Over time, it became entwined with doctrines of original sin and the belief that God actively punished communities for hidden transgressions. Children who were born during eclipses, storms, or on dates associated with bad omens were even more likely to be singled out. This suspicion was not only the domain of peasants. In some cases, local priests reinforced these fears from the pulpit. A particularly severe homily might warn that the sins of parents visited themselves upon children. A failed crop, an epidemic of livestock disease, these could be read as the hand of God striking down the innocent along with the guilty. But when a community needed someone tangible to blame, the innocent became the most convenient scapegoats. Punishments were rarely formal trials. Instead, there were subtler cruelties. Whispers behind doors, stones thrown near the doorstep, children denied playmates. Families might find themselves denied charity in hard times, or forced to the margins of communal life. A mother might watch her child grow up surrounded by suspicion, knowing there was no defense she could offer that would be believed. Some children internalized these judgments early. In rare fragments of letters and testimony, you can read the confusion in their words, young voices asking why God hated them, why neighbors spat when they passed. Imagine the loneliness of a child who cannot remember a day when they were not blamed for things they could not possibly control. Over time, the accusations could escalate. If a child developed a strange habit, a nervous twitch, a tendency to talk in sleep, these behaviors might be read as proof of hidden evil or a pact with dark forces. In the late Middle Ages and into the early modern period, Europe was gripped by a mania for rooting out witches and sorcery. Children were not exempt from suspicion. In some infamous cases, they were interrogated or even punished for supposed witchcraft, all because misfortune needed a face. It is important to understand that communities did not see themselves as cruel. To them, blaming a child for calamity was a way of asserting control over the chaos that ruled their lives. A plague of blight could wipe out an entire harvest overnight. Livestock disease could starve a village. If suffering could be traced to a moral failing, then perhaps it could be corrected. And if it could be corrected, there was hope that God would lift his hand. This is why the accusations were often accompanied by rituals of purification. In some regions, Families would be forced to perform public penance for the child's existence, kneeling in church aisles or making donations to repair the altar as a form of atonement. These acts were meant to cleanse the community of sin, to restore favor in heaven's eyes. But they also cemented the idea that the child was the source of the problem. Such practices did not vanish quickly. Even into the 18th century, you can find echoes of them in rural parishes and small towns. Over time, Enlightenment ideas and growing skepticism about superstition began to weaken these beliefs. But they never disappeared entirely. The human impulse to blame the vulnerable for inexplicable suffering is older than any doctrine and harder to uproot. Today, it is almost impossible to imagine blaming a child for drought or disease. We have the comfort of science to explain the world's caprices, but in a world where science did not exist, where every failed harvest threatened survival, fear demanded an answer on children who could not defend themselves became the answer too often. When you read old parish records and see the notations marking a child as baseborn, remember that these were not abstract labels, they were sentences that followed a child from birth to death. They shaped every interaction, every opportunity denied, every kindness withheld. Behind each record is a story of someone who carried blame they could not possibly deserve. In the silence of old churchyards, in the faded ink of centuries-old registers, those children still bear witness. They remind us how easily fear becomes cruelty, how quickly communities can trade compassion for certainty, and how important it is to remember that no child should ever be made to answer for the tragedies of the world they are born into. Orphans were used as free labor in medieval and early modern Europe. The word orphan did not simply mean a child without parents. It meant a life that no longer belonged to itself. When plague or famine swept through villages, or when war left fathers buried and mothers destitute, countless children were left alone, small figures in doorways, clutching scraps of cloth, waiting for someone to decide their fate. The churches and noble households that took them in were often praised in chronicles for their supposed charity. But, behind the pious language, lay a harsher reality. Orphans were not rescued so much as repurposed and into a source of free labor that could be worked to exhaustion without pay. A child of 6 or 7 might find themselves led through iron gates into a monastery or a manor where the rules of survival were blunt and unapologetic. There was no question of adoption in the sense we understand today. These children were property useful precisely because they were beholden to the institution that fed them. In return for a crust of bread and a straw mat to sleep on, they were expected to work without complaint. Their small hands swept the floors, tended the gardens, cleaned chamber pots, and carried firewood. From dawn to darkness, their lives were measured in tasks completed and burdens carried. Churches justified this arrangement as moral improvement. Labor, it was said, disciplined unruly spirits. A child who worked was a child less likely to fall into sin or idleness. In practice, this doctrine meant that no hour of the day was safe from demands. Monastic orphanages had strict schedules, morning prayers before the light had fully entered the chapel, chores that filled every waking moment, and evenings spent mending clothes or preparing the next day's meals. Even the smallest error could bring punishment, sometimes the withholding of food, sometimes public shame, sometimes blows from a cane. In noble households, the pretense of charity was even thinner. An orphan might be dressed in livery to signify service, but this was no apprenticeship that led to skill or advancement. These children were cheap replacements for adult servants, expected to labor in kitchens, stables, and fields. They carried pails heavier than their own bodies. They scrubbed stones until their hands bled, and at the end of the day, they slept wherever there was space, sometimes in barns, sometimes in the corners of storerooms, grateful only that they had survived another day. Occasionally, a chronicler or visiting cleric would remark on the pale faces and hollow eyes of these children, but such observations rarely led to reform. Orphans had no families to advocate for them, no dowries to make them valuable in marriage, no names important enough to protect them from abuse. Their invisibility was what made them useful. If one sickened and died, there were always others to take their place. Yet even within this bleak system, the children found ways to endure. They formed quiet alliances, shared stolen crusts of bread, whispered stories to each other in the darkness. Some learned to read by eavesdropping on lessons intended for others. Others memorized the habits of their masters so they could avoid beatings. Survival required not just strength, but cunning, a kind of precocious wisdom that no child should have been forced to acquire. The church maintained that all this was ordained by divine order. Work was redemption. Poverty was a test. And those who questioned the treatment of orphans were accused of undermining God's plan. But the truth was simpler and sadder. Exploiting orphan labor saved money. It kept estates running and monasteries clean without the expense of wages. In time, some regions introduced regulations meant to protect these children. Parish records from the later centuries show occasional inspections of orphanages, attempts to ensure that children were clothed and fed. But enforcement was inconsistent, and the prevailing belief that orphans should be grateful for any shelter remained unchallenged. When we look back now, we can see that these children were not saved by charity. They were absorbed by a system that measured their worth in hours worked and silence maintained. They were never invited to imagine futures beyond servitude. The tragedy of their lives is not just that they labored, but that they did so without hope of anything better. And perhaps that is the most sobering lesson. A society can drape its exploitation in the language of virtue. It can call it charity, discipline, moral education. But to the children who bore the weight of it, it was something else, entirely an unending labor that consumed their childhood and left them with little but scars, visible and unseen. Childbirth was a death sentence for many girls. Imagine being 12 years old, still more child than woman, yet your body already burdened with the expectation of motherhood. In much of medieval and early modern Europe, this was not a tragic exception, but an accepted reality. For centuries, childbirth was one of the most common ways a young girl's life could end. Official records, church burial lists, and coroners' rolls tell a grim story. Girls scarcely into puberty, forced into marriages arranged by families desperate to secure land, forge alliances, or simply reduce the number of mouths to feed. The language of the time, maiden mothers, child wives, sounds almost delicate, but the reality was anything but. A girl's first pregnancy was often her last. Her pelvis was not yet fully developed, making obstructed labor a deadly likelihood. In an age before reliable surgical interventions, the result was slow suffocation both for the baby and for the mother. Midwives could attempt to reposition the fetus manually or use primitive tools to extract it. But success was rare, and survival rarer still. One 15th century account describes how entire villages turned out to bury clusters of young mothers, together, their shrouds wrapped tight around bodies not yet grown. Medieval legal codes across Europe did not set consistent minimum ages for marriage or childbirth. Canon law generally held that girls could wed at 12 and boys at 14, provided they had reached puberty. The moment a girl showed any sign of fertility, her first bleeding, her first curved, she was considered ready to bear children. Some families postponed consummation until later, but many did not. In poorer communities, early marriage was encouraged. As a way to secure alliances and ensure a dowry was not lost to rival kin. For noble families, marrying daughters young was a strategy to produce heirs quickly and strengthen dynastic claims. It is difficult to grasp just how routine it was to see pregnancy as a girl's duty rather than her choice. Sermons and devotional texts praised youthful submission. Church authorities preached that obedience in marriage was the highest virtue a girl could display. To defy her father's or husband's will was to invite shame and divine displeasure. Meanwhile, midwives, though often the only ones capable of easing a labor, were condemned by some theologians as practitioners of superstition if they tried folk remedies to ease pain or hasten delivery. The girl in labor had no say over her body, her suffering, or her survival. In many parishes, the burial of these young mothers was treated almost as an ordinary ritual. parish registers sometimes listed them only by first name and age. An wife of John the Younger, aged 13, died in her travail. No marker indicated that she had been a child herself. In some communities, particularly in parts of England and France, it was common to bury groups of maiden mothers together, the sorrow compressed into a single entry in the ledger. These group burials were practical as much as symbolic. High mortality rates meant that coffins and plots were reused quickly, and grief became a dull, familiar ache. The medical ignorance of the time was partly to blame. The prevailing theory of the body was rooted in Galen's ancient teachings, which saw women as inherently weaker, prone to hysteria and corruption. Many physicians believed that suffering in childbirth was divinely ordained, a punishment for Eve's original sin. To mitigate pain was to defy God's will. So when a young girl labored for days, delirious with fever and agony, those around her often stood by with folded hands, offering only prayers and exhortations to be strong. If she survived, she was lauded as pious. If she died, she was praised as a martyr of womanhood. Yet the danger did not end if she lived past the delivery. Puerperal fever, childbed fever, was rampant, spread by unwashed hands and contaminated linens. Even noblewomen, attended by the best physicians, frequently succumbed. For a girl whose body had scarcely finished growing, the risk was even higher. And so, in many places, the average life expectancy for women was dragged down by the merciless arithmetic of childbirth. Conceive early, deliver often, and hope that luck or divine favor would spare you. There were small, quiet acts of compassion. In this landscape of suffering, some midwives defied ecclesiastical prohibitions and applied poultices or herbal concoctions to ease pain. Older women whispered advice on how to breathe, how to bear down, how to survive. But even these gestures were limited by fear of accusations of witchcraft if a birth went wrong, fear of the priest's condemnation, fear of community suspicion. In this atmosphere, a girl's death was mourned, but rarely questioned. It was not until the later Enlightenment that voices began to rise against this normalized tragedy. Some physicians started to track maternal mortality with cold precision, publishing studies that showed the lethal cost of early pregnancy. Philosophers and reformers argued that childhood should be protected, not exploited. But centuries of tradition did not vanish easily. Even into the 19th century, in rural Europe and colonial territories, girls were still married off before their bodies were ready. The ideal of the young, fertile wife remained deeply entrenched. Today, when we hear that childbirth was a death sentence for many girls, it can feel too monstrous to be real. But the evidence is everywhere. In the parish ledgers recording unnamed daughters buried beneath church floors. In the grim Latin marginalia, noting the cause of death as in puerperio, in childbirth. In the skeletal remains, unearthed by archaeologists, showing the narrow pelvic bones of girls whose lives ended in labor. This is not ancient history alone. It is a reminder of how powerlessness can be woven into the very fabric of a society, how the bodies of girls were treated as vessels for lineage, politics, and piety, and how quickly a childhood could be swallowed by expectations that no child should bear. When you picture a maiden mother in her last moments, surrounded by the priest, the midwife, and perhaps her own mother wringing her hands, you see not just one story, but thousands. You see a civilization that learned to normalize the heartbreak of burying girls in groups, and called it the natural order of things. Some children were never named. Imagine the first breath of a newborn in a medieval village, the rush of cold air into tiny lungs, the startled cry breaking the hush of a one-room cottage. In that instant, you might expect relief, even joy. But for countless parents across Europe, joy was dangerous. Love was a risk. And so, the child they held to their chest often remained unnamed, an anonymous little life suspended between existence and oblivion. In a world where as many as half of all infants died before their first birthday, naming a child was not always a priority. Sometimes it was an act postponed until survival seemed more likely. And sometimes, it was never done at all. This practice seems almost unthinkable today. But in the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, High infant mortality shaped nearly every aspect of family life. Disease, malnutrition, and infection struck quickly and without warning. Records from parish registers, manorial rolls, and coroners' inquests all tell the same bleak story. Small graves dug in churchyards week after week. In some regions, it was so common for babies to die before they were baptized or officially named that families adopted a cautious detachment. They referred to a newborn only as the child or the little one, never daring to use an endearment that might tether their hearts too closely to a life so fragile. In England, it was not unheard of for families to wait weeks before arranging a christening. A priest might be summoned only when the child appeared to be gaining weight, or when the first month passed without fever. In parts of Germany and Scandinavia, naming could be delayed longer, sometimes until the child's first birthday. This was not always neglect or cruelty. It was a grim calculation, born of experience. To name a child was to declare them part of the community, to weave them into the fabric of family and faith. But if that child died, and so many did, the grief was almost unbearable. Some parents believed that delaying the name protected the child spiritually. Folk traditions claimed that unnamed infants were less visible to the spirits and demons that prowled the threshold between life and death. A child without a name was thought to be harder to steal, harder to tempt away into the shadows. This belief coexisted uneasily with Christian doctrine, which insisted on baptism as quickly as possible. But in remote villages or during epidemics, these older superstitions often held more sway. Church authorities were keenly aware of this tension. Medieval bishops issued decrees urging parents to baptize and name children within days of birth. They warned that unbaptized babies who died risked eternal limbo. But even these spiritual threats did not always overcome the practical reality of high mortality. In parish records, you can see the pattern. Children listed only as infants with no given name. Their brief existence marked by a line of ink that ended almost before it began. The emotional cost of this practice was profound. Diaries and letters rare, as they are, hint at the silent grief of mothers who never dared to whisper a name. One 15th century Englishwoman wrote of her nameless babe who died at 6 weeks, explaining that she had not yet called him John because she feared he would be summoned back to God. In these few surviving words, you glimpse the impossible contradiction, the hope that a child might live, and the certainty that naming him too soon would make the loss unbearable. Consider how this shaped a child's earliest days. If you were born into such a world, you were an unnamed soul, waiting to be acknowledged. You were fed and wrapped and held, but always at a cautious distance. In some households, mothers were even advised not to look too long into the eyes of an infant until it survived its first illnesses. Affection was rationed like bread. Love was doled out carefully, lest it consume a mother's heart when the fever came. In wealthier families, the ritual of naming was often tied to inheritance and legitimacy. A child who was not named could not be properly entered into lineage records. Some noble households delayed naming until they were sure the baby would survive, to avoid confusion in succession. This left gaps in genealogy's blank spaces where a life flickered only briefly before vanishing. Yet, amid all this caution, there were moments of defiance. Some parents named their children immediately, daring fate to take them. Others secretly whispered names over cradles at night, believing that even if no priest had spoken the word aloud, the child deserved the dignity of an identity. But these gestures were exceptions, not the rule. In many communities, the reality remained stark. Until you proved you could endure, you remained nameless. By the 17th and 18th centuries, medical advances and changing attitudes began to erode this practice. The spread of midwifery manuals encouraged early naming and baptism. Clergy became more insistent that every soul be recognized promptly. But in rural districts and among the poorest families, the old caution lingered. Even into the 19th century, parish registers continued to record unnamed infants buried in unmarked graves. If you close your eyes and imagine that world, you can almost feel its silence, the hush around the hearth. The careful way a mother laid her hand on a tiny chest, measuring each breath. To name the child was to admit hope. To delay was to protect the heart from a grief that had no end. Today, we live in a world where most infants survive, and naming is almost immediate, a joyful rite of belonging. But the history of those nameless children endures as a reminder of how fragile life once was, and how fear can steal even the smallest comfort. The right to be called by name, to be known, if only for a little while. Left-handed children were punished in the dim classrooms and candlelit kitchens of pre-modern Europe. There was a suspicion so pervasive that it seeped into every lesson and every era. Belief that the left hand was not merely different, but unclean, unlucky, even evil. To be left-handed was to be marked by something sinister, a taint that had to be corrected at all costs. For countless children, this superstition translated into years of punishment, shame, and forced conformity. The prejudice against left-handedness has deep roots, stretching far back into antiquity. The very word sinister comes from the Latin for left. In medieval theology, the left side was associated with the devil, witchcraft, and moral corruption. Paintings depicted the damned cast to the left hand of God on Judgment Day. Church sermons warned that favoring the left hand was a sign of stubbornness and pride, a rebellion against the natural order. These ideas were not confined to church walls. They shaped how teachers, parents, and entire communities treated left-handed children. From the moment a child picked up a spoon or a piece of chalk with their left hand, they attracted wary glances and hushed commentary. Some mothers would slap the hand away reflexively, muttering a prayer to ward off evil. Teachers, seeing a child write with the left hand, felt duty-bound to intervene. The most common method was forced retraining, tying the left hand behind the child's back so they had no choice but to use the right. In classrooms, children were made to copy letters endlessly with trembling, unsteady right hands, while their bound, left arms throbbed and went numb. But in some schools and households, the punishments were far more severe. Iron mitts-heavy, crude contraptions were strapped over the left hand to prevent any movement. These devices were often lined with rough metal or leather, chafing the skin raw over hours of wear. Some children were forced to wear them day and night, a constant reminder that their natural inclination was an offense. The logic behind this cruelty was always the same: that left-handedness was a moral failing that could be trained away through discipline and pain. Manuals for teachers described left-handed writing as perverse, claiming it warped the intellect and undermined virtue. In religious schools, left-handed children were subjected to special prayers of exorcism, their hands anointed with holy water as if contaminated by unseen forces. Surviving diaries and letters from the early modern period offer a glimpse into the terror this created. One boy in 17th century England wrote that each morning he dreaded the moment he would be ordered to show his writing hand. If he forgot and extended his left, he could expect a cane across the knuckles so hard he could not hold his slate for hours. Another account from rural France describes a girl who was beaten daily until her left hand was too swollen to grasp anything. Even then, she was scolded for her defiance. Beyond the physical punishments, there was a deep humiliation. Children were called names: devils, spawn, cursed, ungrateful, and made to stand in corners wearing signs that proclaimed their wicked hand. In communities where superstition held firm sway, families felt shame if a child persisted in using the left. Neighbors whispered that such a child would bring misfortune to the household. And so, to protect their reputations, parents became complicit in the abuse. Ironically, many left-handed children possessed natural talents that went unrecognized because they could not express them freely. Their handwriting was labeled sloppy because it was forced. Their reluctance to participate was called laziness, when in truth it was fear. A child who lived under constant threat learned to shrink into themselves, to hide their abilities rather than risk punishment. Even in the 19th century, as new ideas about child development began to emerge, the stigma endured. Medical journals described left-handedness as a form of degeneration, linking it to criminality and mental illness. Doctors proposed that left-handed children were predisposed to deceit and violence. In some countries, phrenologists claimed they could feel the deformity in the shape of the skull. These pseudoscientific theories gave educators and parents further justification to correct left-handedness through ever more elaborate devices and punishments. But despite centuries of oppression, left-handed children often resisted in small ways. Some learned to switch hands in public but reverted to their natural preference in secret. Others developed remarkable ambidexterity, a survival skill forged under pressure. Their quiet defiance reminds us that the human spirit can endure even when every authority demands its surrender. Over time, as psychology advanced and superstition began to recede, these practices slowly fell out of favor. In the early 20th century, reformers started to argue that forcing a child to switch hands caused lasting psychological harm. Studies linked these punishments to anxiety, stuttering, and loss of confidence. Gradually, more enlightened teachers allowed children to write and draw with their dominant hand. But for many who had already been subjected to years of correction, the damage was done. When we look back on this history, it is tempting to shake our heads in disbelief. How could entire societies inflict such cruelty over something as innocuous as handedness? Yet these beliefs were not aberrations, they were the logical consequence of fear and ignorance, dressed up as virtue. They show us how easily prejudice can masquerade as moral duty, and how quickly communities will turn on their own children in the name of conformity. Today, we celebrate left-handedness as just another expression of human variety. But in the quiet corners of old schools, and in the margins of family records, we find the shadows of those who were forced to unlearn themselves. Their stories remind us that the price of superstition is always paid by the most defenseless, and that every time we demand uniformity, we risk crushing the gifts that difference brings. Children were used in religious plays and beaten for mistakes. Imagine a child, no older than 7, standing at the front of a vast stone church. The air is cold and heavy with incense. Dozens of faces stare at him: nobles, merchants, villagers waiting for the first line to pass his lips. In his small hands, he clutches a sheet of parchment covered in Latin script he can barely read. The words are sacred, part of a ritual performance meant to honor God and instruct the faithful. But if he falters, if he stumbles over a syllable, or loses his place, he knows exactly what will happen. In medieval and early modern Europe, religious plays were not reserved for skilled adult actors. Children played a central role in bringing biblical stories to life. From nativity pageants to elaborate passion plays, boys, sometimes girls, were enlisted as performers. Not only because their innocence was thought to reflect divine purity, but because the church saw them as pliable vessels for discipline and devotion. The earliest records of these performances date to the 10th and 11th centuries, when monasteries began staging dramatized versions of the resurrection and other scriptural episodes. Over time, the practice spread into parish churches and town squares. Clerics believed that acting out sacred narratives made them vivid and unforgettable for congregations, many of whom could not read. But the cost of such clarity often fell hardest on the youngest participants. For children, the preparation was rigorous. They were expected to memorize long passages in Latina language they had only begun to learn. Hours of rehearsal were overseen by priests or church wardens, who treated the plays with the same solemnity as a liturgical mass. Any error was interpreted not just as carelessness, but as disrespect to God Himself. Accounts survive describing the punishments children received when they failed to perform perfectly. Chroniclers in England and France wrote of boys being struck across the palms with rods for dropping lines or mispronouncing words. Some were made to kneel on cold stone floors for hours as a warning to others. Public scolding was common. A child who stumbled through a verse could be berated in front of the entire congregation, shamed not only for his mistake, but for what it was thought to represent: spiritual weakness, laziness, or moral failing. These performances were far from simple pageants. In larger towns, church plays could last for days. The York Mystery Plays in England, for example, involved dozens of scenes and hundreds of participants. Children carried the burden of playing angels, prophets, and sometimes Christ as a boy. The pressure to embody these holy figures was immense. Parents, too, faced scrutiny if their children performed poorly, because the family's reputation reflected on the parish itself. Many communities believed that strict discipline was an act of mercy, ensuring the child's soul was trained in humility and obedience. Priests often reminded parents that sparing the rod invited sin to flourish. To us, this logic seems cruel. But in a world where survival depended on conformity, and where faith was the axis of every life decision, fear was considered a necessary teacher. Consider how it must have felt for a child to stand before so many watchful eyes. Imagine the fear, as he searched for the right line, knowing that even a moment's hesitation could lead to punishment. Some children developed nervous tics or stutters that only deepened the cycle of scolding and shame. In a time before modern psychology, such reactions were often dismissed as evidence of a flawed character rather than signs of trauma. These performances also served a political purpose. Church leaders used them to reinforce doctrine, to remind the laity of their place in God's order. A child dressed as an angel declaring the Last Judgment carried a message that no adult could ignore. The visual power of innocence delivering divine warning was deliberate. But it also meant that any imperfection was magnified. A boy who misread the words of Christ's resurrection risked being seen as a weak vessel for holy truth. Over centuries, some reformers began to question whether such severe discipline truly served God. Humanist educators in the 16th century argued that children learned better through kindness and encouragement. But old habits proved stubborn. Even as printed books and vernacular Bibles became more common, the tradition of children in church plays and the harsh discipline that surrounded it endured in many regions well into the early modern period. For parents, these performances were often a source of conflicted pride and dread. To see a son elevated to a sacred role was an honor. To watch him stumble and face public correction was an agony that could stain a family standing for years. In letters and chronicles, there are glimpses of mothers comforting their children afterward, whispering that they did their best, even as fathers and priests declared that God demanded more. Sometimes the plays themselves contained lines about sin and punishment that echoed the reality of the rehearsal hall. A child might recite warnings about eternal damnation, while secretly fearing a beating for forgetting the next verse. The blending of spiritual awe and physical fear created memories that some carried into adulthood with lasting scars. Yet communities saw these experiences as part of forming righteous adults. A child who learned to endure humiliation was thought to be more likely to resist temptation later in life. A boy who learned to master his voice and bearing in front of a congregation was believed to be more likely to serve God and Lord with proper discipline. It is tempting to dismiss such practices as relics of ignorance, but they were woven into the very structure of medieval society. The church was the center of community life. Rituals shaped every milestone from birth to death, and children, with their vulnerability and malleability, were caught in the middle of that order. When you step into an old cathedral and admire the carvings of angels and saints, remember that behind those images stood real children, trembling under the weight of expectation. Remember that the beautiful Latin chants were sometimes learned in fear, the graceful gestures rehearsed under threat of the rod. Their voices may be silent now, but the traces remain in parish records that noted fines for mistakes. In the sermons that demanded strict discipline, in the worn flagstones where small feet once shuffled nervously, they are reminders of how easily faith, fear, and power can entwine, and how the most vulnerable often bear the heaviest burdens in the name of devotion. Boys were sent to war before they had beards. In medieval Europe, a boy born to a noble house learned early that his life was never truly his own. From the moment he took his first unsteady steps, expectations gathered around him like invisible armor. He would be a warrior, a defender of his family's honor, an instrument of power in an age that revered the sword above almost everything else. Yet, For all the grandeur of heraldry and the chivalric oaths that adorned this vision, the truth was far starker. Boys were sent to war before they had beards, before they knew the feel of a lover's hand or the weight of their own choices. At 13 or 14, a noble son was expected to become a squire. This was not a ceremonial role, but a demanding apprenticeship in the brutal art of warfare. The boy would be placed in the household of a knight or lord, someone who would train him to fight, to serve, and above all to obey without hesitation. His duties were unglamorous: cleaning armor that weighed more than he did, tending horses, sharpening blades, carrying messages across treacherous terrain. These tasks were meant to harden him, to strip away softness, and to prepare him for the day when he would enter battle as a combatant rather than an attendant. For some, that day came almost immediately. In times of conflict, and medieval Europe was rarely without conflict, lords pressed every available body into service. If the levy was called, or the banner raised, even the youngest squires were expected to march. They followed their masters to the front lines, eyes wide with fear and wonder. Hearts beating so fast it must have felt as though they would burst. Chroniclers wrote of boys so young they scarcely had the strength to lift their own swords, their faces still soft with childhood. Yet they were thrust into the chaos of battle without hesitation. No training could truly prepare them for what awaited. The clash of armies was not the noble contest sung about in ballads. It was confusion, screams, the stink of blood and sweat and earth churned by charging horses. Squires were supposed to stay close to their knights, to help replace damaged weapons and tend wounds, but battle cared little for protocol. A boy might find himself alone, shield raised against blows meant to kill. In the melee, age was no protection. Many never returned. Their names were recorded in ledgers and family chronicles, but their stories ended almost as soon as they began. A first campaign was often a last campaign. Those who survived were changed forever. Some bore wounds that never healed properly. Others carried memories that haunted their sleep. And yet this cycle continued for generations, because to be noble was to accept this risk as a matter of duty and pride. Parents rarely questioned the custom. A father who had once been sent to war as a boy expected no different for his son. A mother might weep as her child rode away, but she would remind herself that honor demanded sacrifice. Even the church sanctioned the practice, blessing the boys and assuring families that those who died in battle were martyrs of a sort, warriors in a holy struggle. In truth, it was as much about politics as piety. Noble houses relied on military service to secure lands and favor. A family whose sons fought bravely, even if they died young, gained prestige. A lord who sent no one risked being seen as cowardly, and so the boys went still growing into their own bodies, still forming their ideas of the world, already expected to give their lives for causes they barely understood. They rode out under banners that seemed impossibly large above their small frames. They memorized the colors of their house and the words of their family motto, reciting them like incantations against fear. But no motto could shield them from the reality of steel meeting flesh, of arrows falling in black clouds, of friends collapsing beside them. If they returned, they were no longer children. Survival became a mark of honor, but also a heavy burden. Some squires were knighted on the battlefield, drenched in blood rather than anointed in church. Others came home with empty eyes, their youth extinguished in a single season of war. Modern readers might find it unthinkable to send a child to such horrors, but in that world, boyhood ended early, sometimes before a voice had deepened or a beard had begun to grow, and for all the rituals of knighthood, all the pomp and ceremony. This was the truth behind the legend. Children were sent to war because no one thought to spare them. Some were buried alive during plagues. Imagine the terror of an age when death moved so fast that it outpaced all certainty, when the line between life and death blurred under the shadow of plague. In medieval Europe, outbreaks of the Black Death and later waves of bubonic plague turned cities and villages into charnel grounds. Every hour brought new corpses. Every dawn revealed bodies slumped in doorways or piled at thresholds, abandoned in the desperate hope that removal would save the living. Fear was so complete that it overrode compassion, caution, and, often, the last fragile rituals of care. The urgency to dispose of the dead quickly was not merely a matter of superstition, but of survival. Physicians and clerics believed corrupt air rising from decaying bodies was the primary vector of infection. They instructed that bodies be removed and buried before dawn, when the air was believed most stagnant. In villages, carts trundled from house to house, collecting corpses heaped in linen sheets. Those too poor for burial cloth were wrapped in straw and tied with rope. In larger towns, death pits were dug overnight. Parish registers show pages inked thick with names, recording dozens, sometimes hundreds of burials in a single day. Yet the speed of this grim harvest carried its own horrors. Children, especially, could slip into fever comas so deep they appeared lifeless. A small body burning with infection might become limp, breath so shallow it barely stirred the chest. In a candlelit room where neighbors worked in haste, no one lingered to check twice. Sometimes, there was no priest to confirm death, no midwife to touch a pulse. Only the clamor of panic, the dread of contagion, and the instinct to flee. Accounts from the 14th and 15th centuries are full of stories whispered across generations, of children awakening beneath heaps of earth, of soft cries that no one heard or chose to hear. Chroniclers like Jean de Venette recorded that entire households were sealed in their homes if plague was suspected. Doors were nailed shut, windows boarded, and guards stationed to prevent escape. If anyone inside survived the first days, they often died anyway of thirst, of suffocation, or of the terror of being entombed alive. In Florence, Boccaccio wrote that neighbors dared not look too closely. Many died who would perhaps have recovered if they had been cared for, he observed, but fear made all merciless. And so families carried their children out on boards or wrapped them in sheets, laying them at the lip of a pit before slipping away. Some municipalities even banned final prayers, believing any delay increased the risk of infection. Archaeological evidence supports these stories. Mass graves in England, Italy, and Germany contain skeletons whose limbs are contorted in ways suggesting movement after burial arms twisted across the face. Fingers curled in the dirt. Anthropologists have studied these positions and concluded they are not the result of settling soil. Rather, they indicate desperate attempts to push upward, to claw toward air. Perhaps the most haunting detail is how routine it became. The chroniclers did not always linger on these moments. They recorded them almost as afterthoughts, some not dead yet, or some children in swoon. The ordinariness of it, the matter-of-fact tone reveals how plague trained communities to accept the unacceptable. When dozens died each day, grief was a luxury, and certainty was an impossibility. The fear of premature burial did not vanish after the plague years. For centuries, it haunted European culture. In the 17th and 18th centuries, inventors designed safety coffins fitted with bells, flags, or pipes through which a person might signal if they revived underground. But during the medieval plagues, no such precautions existed. Even noble families, who might have afforded doctors or clergy to confirm death, often chose speed over certainty. In the countryside, burial teams sometimes arrived days after a death was reported, and they worked in darkness with only torches for light. One eyewitness wrote that it was impossible to know whether the small bodies bundled in linen were already dead or merely insensible. God knows their fate, he added, for no man had the courage to look twice. It is tempting to judge these actions from the safety of distance. But the reality is that fear makes monsters of ordinary people. In a world without antibiotics or understanding of disease vectors, no parent could know whether staying near a sick child would cost the lives of everyone else in the house. And so, one by one, communities learned to shut their eyes, to close the door, to walk away. Yet even amid such terror, there were glimpses of humanity that refused to be extinguished. Some parish priests, immune from fear or simply resigned to death, insisted on performing last rites, sometimes discovering that a child still breathed. A handful of mothers refused to let strangers carry their children to the pit. They sat beside them until the end, no matter the danger, believing that the final act of love was to bear witness, even if it meant joining them in death. When you hear that some were buried alive during plagues, understand this was not a folktale or a rumor to frighten children into obedience. It was a recurring nightmare woven into the collective memory of Europe. Generations passed down the stories in hushed voices, tales of small hands scratching at coffin lids, of muffled cries beneath the soil. These memories became part of a cultural inheritance, a cautionary echo that reminded the living how thin the boundary between life and death could be, and in that echo is a truth as old as humanity, that in times of fear, we are forced to choose between survival and mercy. Sometimes we fail, sometimes we walk away, and sometimes, in the face of the worst darkness, we stay and keep our hand on the still chest of a child, hoping against hope that the faintest breath will rise again. Which accusations targeted children too. Imagine you are a child in a small village surrounded by forests so dark they seem alive. You are 7 years old. Perhaps you were born with a twisted foot or a withered hand. Perhaps you sometimes fall to the ground in convulsions, your mouth frothing, your body shaking with a terror you cannot name. In another age, you might have been taken to a physician or comforted by your mother. But in this world, you are marked. And before you understand the word, you will hear it whispered about you, which we often imagine the witch hunts of early modern Europe as targeting women, older widows, midwives, healers. But the truth is darker still. Children too were accused, imprisoned, and sometimes executed for witchcraft. From the late 15th century through the 17th century, fear of the devil and his supposed servants consumed entire communities. No one was too young to fall under suspicion. In fact, some authorities argued that children were especially vulnerable to Satan's influence because they were weak and easily corrupted. The evidence that condemned a child could be heartbreakingly trivial. A birthmark shaped vaguely like a serpent, a seizure witnessed by neighbors, a dream in which the child claimed to have flown or spoken with a shadowy figure. In places like Germany, Scotland, and parts of France, records survive of children as young as 5 accused of witchcraft. They were sometimes examined by panels of elders and clergy. Their small bodies searched for the devil's marker spot, insensitive to pain. Imagine the terror of a child forced to strip before strangers while cold irons or needles prodded their skin. One of the most haunting examples comes from the Wurzburg witch trials of the 1620s. In a frenzy of accusation and confession, entire families were swept into prison. The chronicles record that over 40 children were accused and interrogated. Some were tortured to extract confessions, children no older than your own sons or daughters today. Under duress, they admitted to impossible things: flying on brooms, consorting with demons, casting curses that killed cattle. These confessions, though clearly the result of fear and confusion, were accepted as proof. Epileptic fits were especially suspect. Before medical science could explain seizures, people saw them as evidence of diabolic possession. A child who convulsed or spoke in a trance was thought to be channeling dark powers. Some parents tried desperately to hide such symptoms. They would keep children indoors, away from prying eyes, in the hope of escaping suspicion. But in small villages where everyone knew everyone's business, secrets were almost impossible to keep. Children were not only victims, they were also used as instruments of accusation. Witch hunters and magistrates believed that children, being innocent, were more likely to tell the truth when questioned. Some trials relied heavily on the testimony of young accusers. Under pressure or manipulation, children named neighbors or even family members as witches. In the infamous Salem trials of 1692, it was the visions and claims of girls barely into adolescence that fueled the hysteria. When children accused adults, their words carried an almost sacred authority. To question them was to risk siding with the devil. Consider the psychological burden of this. A child who accused another might be praised as brave, righteous, chosen to reveal the hidden evil. But as soon as the wave of hysteria receded, Many of these same children were shunned or pitied. Their reputations forever stained by their role in sending people to the gallows. The process of interrogation was brutal, even for the very young. Some were deprived of sleep or food until they confessed. Others were threatened with execution if they did not name accomplices. Imagine being 8 years old, alone in a dark cell, your hands bound, your mind clouded by hunger and terror. You would say anything to make it stop. Once a child confessed. The machinery of punishment began. Sentences varied. Some children were imprisoned or beaten. Others were banished from their communities. A few, especially in regions with the harshest laws, were executed. Records from Switzerland and parts of Germany detail burnings of children convicted of witchcraft tragedies almost too terrible to contemplate. Why did societies allow this? The answer lies in fear and the hunger for control. When crops failed, when plagues returned, when families died mysteriously, people needed someone to blame. The devil offered a convenient explanation, and witches real or imagined became the scapegoats. Children with deformities, illnesses, or unusual dreams were the most defenseless targets. They could not refute the accusations with authority. Their lives were worth less in the eyes of a world obsessed with purity. Some voices did rise in protest. Clergy and scholars argued that children could not truly consent to serve the devil, that their confessions were worthless under torture. In the 17th century, more skeptical judges began to dismiss cases involving very young suspects. But in remote regions, the old beliefs persisted, reinforced by generations of fear. Imagine a village gathered for a trial. A child stands on a wooden platform, too small to see over the rail, accused of dark arts. The crowd watches with solemn horror. Perhaps some feel pity, but few dare to intervene. To defend the accused was to risk being accused yourself. So the child remains alone, trapped in a nightmare that no amount of innocence can dispel. Today, historians look back on these trials with a mixture of sorrow and disbelief. We see how ignorance and superstition can warp a community until it devours its own children. And yet, we must remember that to the people who lived through it, the fear felt real. The devil was not an abstraction. He was a presence, blamed for every misfortune, every unexplained death. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the hushed prayers, the muffled sobs, the accusing voices. In those sounds lies a truth about human nature. When fear takes root, no one, especially not the innocent, is truly safe. The story of children accused of witchcraft is a testament to how easily love can curdle into suspicion, and how quickly a society can turn on its most vulnerable. Girls who spoke up were called possessed in the flickering shadows of medieval convents and village churches. There was a fear more potent than disease or famine, the fear that the devil himself could seize the mind of a girl who refused to keep silent. For centuries, any sign of disobedience in a daughter could be interpreted not as ordinary defiance, but as evidence of possession. A girl who raised her voice in anger, who questioned her father's authority, or who simply spoke too boldly was seen as a vessel for dark forces that had to be driven out by ritual and pain. In many European communities, especially in the late Middle Ages and early modern period, belief in demonic influence was woven into every aspect of life. Clergymen preached that Satan was constantly prowling, seeking entry into households through the weakest link, often presumed to be women and children. Girls were considered especially susceptible because they were thought to be more emotional, more impressionable, and therefore more easily corrupted. When a young woman cried out in frustration or refused an arranged marriage, her family might genuinely believe that her will was no longer her own. These ideas were not abstract superstition, but structured doctrine. Manuals of demonology instructed priests to watch for signs of possession that today would be recognized as ordinary expressions of grief, rage, or trauma. A girl who wept uncontrollably, who refused food, or who spoke back could be listed among the afflicted. Once suspicion took root, it spread like wildfire. Neighbors would testify that she had always been willful, that she often wandered alone, that she had been seen talking to herself. Each scrap of gossip added weight to the accusation. The rituals that followed were harrowing. A suspected possessed child could be seized and brought before the parish priest or a visiting inquisitor. There, she would be questioned for hours about her visions, her dreams, her feelings, her every word twisted into evidence of corruption. If she denied wrongdoing or insisted she was innocent, this defiance only confirmed the diagnosis. After all, it was believed that the devil encouraged lies to protect his hold. In many cases, exorcism was the prescribed cure. The girl would be restrained in a cold room, sometimes tied to a bed or a wooden frame. Priests chanted Latin prayers, sprinkled holy water, and demanded the demon reveal its name. If she screamed or struggled, it was proof the rite was working. If she sobbed or fell silent, it was taken as submission to God's power. From the outside, these rituals appeared solemn and righteous, but to the child at the center, they were nothing less than terror cloaked in piety. Even more common than formal exorcism was isolation. Families who could not afford or dared not call a priest might simply confine the girl to a small chamber. Sometimes for weeks, food was slipped under the door. Visitors were forbidden. The purpose was to break the will that had allegedly opened the door to demonic influence. For some girls, the loneliness was more unbearable than any physical punishment. They emerged from these confinements, changed, quieter, fearful, resigned. Yet historians have shown that many of these girls were not mentally ill or possessed at all. They were simply rebelling against a world that offered them no choices. Some were protesting an unwanted marriage. Some were grieving a lost sibling. Some were angry at constant humiliation and beatings. But in a society determined to read female disobedience as supernatural, no amount of reasoning could save them. Perhaps the most tragic dimension of these accusations was how quickly they could escalate. A girl labeled as possessed was marked. For life, she might be barred from marrying or forced into a convent. Her family would suffer shame, sometimes losing standing in the community. In rare cases, suspicion of possession bled into charges of witchcraft and accusation that could end not in exorcism but in execution. Records from Germany, France, and England are filled with cases in which teenage girls were first accused of possession for arguing with their fathers. In one instance, a young woman in Normandy refused to accept a betrothal arranged without her consent. Her refusal was interpreted as evidence that she was under a dark influence. She was dragged before the local priest, where she endured 3 days of exorcism before finally collapsing. Afterward, she never spoke above a whisper again. While modern audiences might imagine that only remote villages practiced such cruelty, the truth is that the obsession with demonic possession stretched into cities and even noble households. Learned men, doctors, theologians, magistrates joined in the chorus of condemnation. They wrote treatises explaining how the devil preyed on weak female minds and declared that a father's duty was to root out disobedience wherever it appeared. This merging of religious fervor and patriarchal control made any challenge from a daughter intolerable. Yet even in these darkest moments, small acts of resistance survived. Some mothers secretly intervened to protect their daughters, insisting they were merely sick, not possessed. Some priests refused to perform exorcisms without clear evidence. Though their caution was often resented by communities hungry for a scapegoat, a few brave girls, when given a chance to speak, defended themselves with words so clear and defiant that they shocked their accusers into silence, if only briefly. When we look back, it is easy to recoil at the injustice, but it's also important to recognize how these accusations fit into a broader system of control. The fear of possession was not only about religion, it was about power. A girl who dared to name her own desires, to protest her treatment, or to claim ownership of her voice, posed a threat to the entire hierarchy. By labeling her possessed, society could punish and neutralize her rebellion, while convincing itself that it acted out of moral necessity. Today, we no longer see outspoken girls as demon-touched. Yet echoes of this mindset remain. Even now, women who speak their minds are called hysterical or unstable. Their anger is pathologized, their refusal to submit still seen as unnatural. The story of girls labeled possessed for daring to speak is a reminder that every generation must reckon with the fear of female autonomy and the lengths to which societies will go to suppress it.